My son-in-law, a man who built his fortune on the ruins of other people's dreams, once told me that my house was nothing more than an asset waiting to be liquidated. During a family dinner, he threw a heavy whiskey glass at my head because I refused to serve him, yelling that a servant's job was to obey. He was right about one thing: the house was an asset, but it was my asset, and what he didn't know was that 15 years ago I had turned this house into a weapon. The next morning, when he woke up to the sound of power tools, he learned that the old servant he tried to put in his place was about to become his master. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire world without raising my voice, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is something you earn, not something you can demand. My name is Elijah Carter. I am 75 years old, and for the first 50 years of my adult life, I believed that love was enough to build a family. The last few years have taught me that sometimes you also need a foundation of unshakable, cold, hard law. The silence in the dining room was heavy, thick with things unsaid. It was the kind of silence I had grown accustomed to since my daughter Lena had married Connor Sterling. Before him, this room used to echo with laughter, with the warm voice of my late wife Rose, with the sounds of a family. Now it was a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial. Connor swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, the ice cubes clinking like a slow, ominous clock. He had this way of looking around my home, the home I designed and built with my own two hands, not with admiration, but with the cold calculation of a developer assessing a plot of land. His eyes would scan the hand-carved mahogany trim, the vaulted ceilings, the wide plank oak floors that I had salvaged from a historic library in downtown Atlanta, and I could almost hear the numbers ticking in his head. "You know, Eli," he said, his voice slick with false deference, "it's amazing how these old places hold up. Real character." It was a backhanded compliment, a prelude to a familiar lecture. But the market's changing. People want modern, open concept, less clutter. I knew what he meant by clutter. He meant my books, the shelves filled with the history of architecture, the stories of men who built empires of stone and steel. He meant Rose's collection of porcelain birds, each one a memory of a trip we took together. He meant me. Lena shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fork tracing patterns in her mashed potatoes. "Connor, we talked about this," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. My daughter, a brilliant attorney who could dismantle a hostile witness in court, became a mouse in her husband's presence. She loved me, I knew that. But she was also mesmerized by the world. Connor represented a world of country clubs and private jets, a world so far removed from the one I had built for her, a world grounded in dignity and hard work. I remained silent, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. I had learned that arguing with Connor was like wrestling with a pig in mud. You both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. He was baiting me, trying to provoke a reaction to paint me as a stubborn old man clinging to the past. He wanted to create a narrative for Lena, a story where selling my home and moving me into a luxury retirement community was an act of kindness, not greed. The roast chicken on the platter between us grew cold. The air grew colder still. It was a suffocating tension, the kind that precedes a storm. I was just waiting for the first crack of thunder, and I didn't have to wait long. Connor drained his glass, the last ice cube rattling as he slammed it down on the polished wood of the dining table. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He slid the empty glass across the table toward me, a gesture of pure arrogance. It stopped just short of my plate. He didn't say please. He didn't even look at me as an equal. He looked at me the way a king looks at a cupbearer. "More whiskey," he commanded, his voice low and guttural. I looked at the bottle of 18-year-old single malt on the sideboard, a gift from a former client. Then I looked at Connor's flushed face, the slight slur in his words, the predatory glint in his eyes. I had seen this look before. It was the look of a man who believed his wealth made him infallible, who saw other people not as human beings, but as instruments for his will. This was not about another drink. This was about power. It was about him establishing dominance in my home at my table. My entire life I had faced men who tried to diminish me to put me in my place. I had faced them in boardrooms, on construction sites, and in the quiet, insidious corridors of polite society. I had never once let them succeed. I was not about to start now, not in the house that held my wife's memory. I made a calm, quiet decision. I would not be a servant tonight. "I think you've had enough for tonight, Connor," I said, My voice was even devoid of anger or judgment. It was simply a statement of fact. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall became deafening. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Connor's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. Disbelief warred with fury on his face. He wasn't just surprised, he was profoundly offended. It was as if a tool had suddenly refused to work. A tool he believed he owned. He slowly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. A cruel, ugly smirk twisted his lips. "What did you say?" he hissed, leaning forward. I did not repeat myself. I simply held his gaze, a quiet refusal that was more powerful than any shouted word. In that moment, I was no longer a father-in-law. I was a boundary, and he was a man who hated boundaries more than anything else in the world. The smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure rage. "You live in my wife's house," he spat, his voice dripping with venom, conveniently forgetting that Lena had no legal title to it yet. "You eat the food I pay for." He was building his case, justifying the violence that was already coiling inside him. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the table over me. I did not shrink back. I had faced bigger men than him, men with far more power than his fleeting wealth. And then came the words that would change everything. The words that severed the last thread of respect I had for him. The words that ignited the war. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face contorted. "Servants must obey." With a roar of pure, unrestrained rage, he snatched the heavy crystal tumbler from the table. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the tumbler leave his hand, a glinting missile of crystal and malice. I saw Lena's eyes widen in horror, her hand flying to her mouth, a silent scream trapped in her throat. I didn't flinch. I didn't duck. I simply turned my head slightly, a small, economical movement. The glass sailed past my cheek so close I could feel the rush of air and shattered against the wall behind me. The sound was explosive, a violent crash that ripped the silence to shreds. A shower of glittering shards rained down onto the antique mahogany sideboard my father had made. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of my own breathing and the faint tinkle of a final piece of glass falling to the floor. I saw the deep gouge the tumbler had left in the plaster, a white scar on the deep crimson paint that Rose had chosen. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and warmth out of the room. Lena was frozen, a statue of shock and disbelief. Connor stood panting, his chest heaving, his face a mask of primal fury. The civilized veneer had cracked, revealing the brute beneath. An act of such profound disrespect had been committed that there was no going back. The line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated with a shard of glass. I slowly, deliberately placed my napkin on the table. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My movements were unhurried, measured. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of clarity that comes in the eye of a hurricane. I did not look at Connor. I did not look at my daughter. My gaze was fixed on the wreckage on the sideboard. I walked over to the wall, ignoring the crunch of glass under my shoes. With an architect's eye, I assessed the damage. It was cosmetic, but the insult was structural. It was a violation. I bent down my old knees, protesting slightly, and began to pick up the larger pieces of glass. One sharp shard sliced into the palm of my hand. I watched, almost detached, as a single drop of dark red blood welled up and trickled down my lifeline. I felt no pain. Or perhaps the pain in my heart was so great it eclipsed anything my body could feel. This was good. This was real. A physical manifestation of the wound that had just been inflicted on my soul. I clenched my fist, the glass digging deeper, the blood flowing more freely. It felt right. I gathered the glittering fragments in my other hand and walked back to the table. I opened my palm and let the broken pieces fall onto Connor's dinner plate right next to his half-eaten chicken. They landed with a series of sharp accusatory clicks. Only then did I raise my eyes to meet his. He recoiled slightly, as if the broken glass were a snake. I said nothing. My silence was my answer. It was my judgment. It was my declaration of war. I turned and walked out of the dining room, each footstep echoing in the cavernous silence. I could feel Lena's horrified gaze on my back, could feel Connor's impotent rage burning holes in the air. I didn't care. I walked up the grand staircase, my hand trailing along the smooth, cool wood of the banister I had sanded myself. In the upstairs bathroom, I held my bleeding palm under a stream of cold water. I watched as the water turned pink, washing away the blood, but not the insult. The cut was clean deep. It would need stitches, but I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me go to a hospital tonight. I found the first aid kit under the sink and began to meticulously clean the wound. I was an architect, a man of precision. I treated my own injury with the same careful attention to detail I would give a blueprint. As I wrapped the sterile gauze around my hand, my mind was surprisingly clear. The shock had given way to a cold, hard certainty. Something had been broken tonight, and it wasn't just a whiskey glass. It was the fragile peace I had tried to maintain for Lena's sake. It was the illusion that this was a family. Connor hadn't just thrown a glass at me. He had thrown down a gauntlet. He had revealed his true nature, his contempt, his belief that my home, my life, my very dignity were his to command. He saw me as an obstacle, a relic to be cleared away. And Lena, my dear Lena, had stood by and watched. Her silence was a form of consent. Her inaction was a betrayal as sharp as any shard of glass. I finished tying off the bandage, the white gauze a stark contrast against my dark skin. The physical pain was a dull throb now, a distant echo of the real wound. I had spent my life building things, bridges, libraries, community centers. And this house, this beautiful, strong house, my masterpiece, my sanctuary, I had built it to protect my family. But now the threat was not outside the walls. It was living inside them. The cut in my hand was no longer just an injury. It had become a symbol, a reminder of the moment the battle lines were drawn. It was the price of admission for the war that was about to begin. And as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, at the old but unbroken man staring back, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was a war I intended to win. I walked into my bedroom and closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding final like a cell door locking into place. My gaze fell upon the silver-framed photograph on my nightstand. It was a picture of Rose and me taken on our 40th wedding anniversary just a year before she passed. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of the light and love that had been my anchor for half a century. We were standing on the front porch of this very house, the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves of the ancient oak tree I had refused to cut down. I picked up the frame, my bandaged hand looking clumsy against the delicate silver. "Oh, Rose," I whispered to the empty room, "what would you do?" I could almost hear her voice, calm and steady as always. "You know what to do, Eli. You've always known." We had built this life together, brick by brick, promise by promise. She had been the heart of this home, and I had been its bones. I remember when we bought this land decades ago. It was nothing but a wild, overgrown plot that everyone else overlooked. But I saw the potential. I saw the way the light fell in the morning, the strength of the old oaks. I drew up the blueprints myself late at night at the kitchen table of our tiny apartment, while Rose made coffee and told me I was a magician who could build dreams out of ink and paper. She believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Every dollar we saved went into this place. I did most of the work myself with the help of a few good friends on the weekends. I laid the foundation, raised the walls, and set every last brick into place. Rose was right there beside me, not with a hammer, but with sandwiches and lemonade with unwavering support. Her presence a constant source of strength. This house wasn't a purchase, it was a creation. Every room held an echo of our life. The kitchen where she taught Lena how to bake, the living room where we danced on our 25th anniversary, the garden where she planted the roses that still bloomed every spring, a stubborn, beautiful legacy. And this bedroom, this was our sanctuary. When she got sick, I had cared for her here. I had refused to let her go to a sterile hospital, converting our room into a place of comfort where she could be surrounded by the life we had built. I remembered the long nights holding her hand, reading her favorite poems by Langston Hughes, promising her I would always look after our Lena, that I would always protect our home. "This house is our story, Eli," she had told me, her voice as thin as parchment. "Don't ever let anyone tear out the pages." I looked at her smiling face in the photograph, a woman of grace and iron will. Now Connor, with his greedy eyes and Wu-Reda hands, wanted to bulldoze our story and turn this sacred place into a soulless condominium complex. The thought made something hard and cold settle in my chest. It was the feeling of steel being forged. He didn't just see a house. He saw a barrier to his ambition. He didn't see me as a father. He saw me as a stubborn old man, a piece of clutter to be cleared away. I placed the photograph back on the nightstand, my movements precise. The conversation was over. Rose had reminded me of my promise. She had reminded me of who I was. I was Elijah Carter. I was a builder. I had built a life, a family, and a home, and I would be damned if I let a man like Connor Sterling tear it all down. The pain in my hand was a steady grounding rhythm. My purpose was clear. This wasn't about revenge. This was about preservation. This was about honoring a legacy. My legacy. Rose's legacy. This house was our story, and it was time I wrote the next chapter. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under my weight. From downstairs I could hear them, not shouting anymore, but murmuring, low, urgent whispers that were somehow more venomous than Connor's earlier roar. The sounds traveled up the staircase and seeped under my door. I didn't want to listen. A part of me, the father who had raised Lena to be strong and independent, wanted to believe she was downstairs defending me, defending the sanctity of our home. But the architect in me, the man who understood that a structure is only as strong as its weakest point, knew. I had to understand the full extent of the damage. I rose and walked silently to the door, my bare feet making no sound on the thick Persian rug. I didn't press my ear to the wood like some character in a cheap play. I simply stood a few feet away in the shadows of my own room and let the sounds come to me. At first it was just the cadence, the rhythm of their conflict. Lena's voice was high, pleading, laced with a desperation that pained me. Connor's was a low, guttural rumble, the sound of a predator growling over its kill. Then words began to emerge from the murk. Completely unacceptable, Connor. He's my father. That was Lena, her voice sharp with a brief flash of the lawyer she was. He's an old man living in our house, Lena. Connor's voice shot back, laced with contempt. He disrespected me, in front of you. What was I supposed to do, thank him? You threw a glass at him, she cried, her voice cracking. It's a miracle it didn't hit him. You could have blinded him. There was a pause. I imagined Connor running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, feigning a remorse he didn't feel. It was the heat of the moment, he said, his tone softening, becoming dangerously reasonable. He provoked me. You know how he is, with his silent judgment, always looking down on me, on us. He was twisting it, reframing his violent outburst as a justifiable reaction to my supposed arrogance. He was painting himself as the victim. I waited, holding my breath, praying for Lena to see through the manipulation, to hold her ground. That's not true, she started, but her voice faltered. It lacked conviction. And then the shift came. It was subtle at first, a change in pitch, a softening of her resolve. The anger in her voice dissolved, replaced by something I recognized all too well, the weary tone of appeasement. She was no longer fighting for me, she was now managing him. Okay, she sighed, and that one word was a white flag of surrender. Look, his pride was hurt. Your pride was hurt. It was a terrible night for everyone. My pride, Connor scoffed. This isn't about pride, Lena. This is about the future. Our future. That stubborn old man is sitting on a $10 million asset while we're stretching ourselves thin to maintain our lifestyle. There it was. The raw, ugly truth laid bare. It was never about respect. It was always about the money. About the house. The final fatal blow came in a whisper so soft I almost missed it. It was Lena's voice, stripped of all defiance, full of a tired resignation that broke my heart. I know, my love, she murmured. I know you're right. I'll talk to him. In the morning. We'll figure it out. Just, come on. Let's go to bed. Please. I heard the sound of footsteps, a door closing down the hall, and then silence. A silence far heavier and more profound than before. I stepped back from my door as if it were electrified. I felt no anger. The rage had burned out, leaving behind only the cold gray ash of certainty. She had chosen. In the great conflict between her father and her husband, between the legacy of her past and the ambition of her future, she had chosen him. My daughter, my brilliant, strong Lena, had sided with the man who called me a servant. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't a loud, dramatic event. It was a quiet, whispered thing that had happened in a hallway, but it had the force of a wrecking ball, demolishing the last support beam of the family I thought I had. I was alone now. Utterly and completely alone in this fight. And in that moment I knew that my quiet, dignified life was over. The architect had to become a warrior. A new kind of silence settled over the house. It was not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the sterile, empty silence of a museum after closing time, the silence of a place where life used to be. I did not move from my spot by the door. I simply stood there, a statue in the dark, listening to the echoes of my daughter's betrayal. The pain in my hand was a dull, steady beat, a physical anchor in a world that had suddenly come loose from its moorings. It was a metronome counting down the seconds of my old life, a life where I believed I was a father, a grandfather, the patriarch of a family. That life was now over. A terrible clarity washed over me, cold and sharp as the shard of glass that had cut my skin. I was not a person to them anymore, not family. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle on a blueprint for their future. My home, this structure of memory and love, was not a home in their eyes. It was an asset, a line item on a balance sheet, and I was the inconvenient occupant, the stubborn old man who needed to be managed, placated, and eventually removed. Connor's contempt I had understood. He was a simple creature driven by greed and a sense of entitlement. His cruelty was straightforward. But Lena's betrayal was a far more complex and devastating thing. She had not defended me. She had managed the situation. She had treated my deep, profound humiliation as a temper tantrum, to be soothed, a negotiation to be handled. She weighed my dignity against her husband's ambition and found my dignity wanting. She spoke of my pride being hurt, as if it were a minor inconvenience easily fixed with a few comforting words in the morning. She did not understand. It was not my pride that was wounded. It was my heart. It was the very foundation of my belief in her, in us. For 40 years I had been her protector, her champion, her safe harbor. Tonight, when the storm came, she had not sought shelter with me. She had sided with the storm itself. I looked around my room at the familiar shapes of the furniture in the darkness. The highboy dresser Rose had inherited from her grandmother. The armchair where I had read hundreds of bedtime stories to Lena. These were not just objects. They were witnesses, and tonight they had witnessed the end of an era. The man who had walked into this room an hour ago was a father. The man who stood here now was something else entirely. He was a variable in an equation, a roadblock. The clarity was a painful gift. It burned away all the sentimental fog, all the excuses I had made for Lena's behavior over the years. It left only the stark, undeniable truth. I was in their way. Sleep was an impossible luxury now. The night was not for resting. It was for thinking, for planning. My entire life had been about structure, about design, about understanding how things fit together. I had built structures to withstand time and the elements. Now I had a new project. I had to design a response, not one born of anger or a desire for petty revenge. No, it had to be a structure of pure, unassailable logic, a fortress of fact and law. Connor saw this house as a financial opportunity. Lena saw it as a complication in her marriage. They had both forgotten what it truly was. It was my home, and I was about to teach them, and my daughter most of all, what it means to try and tear down a master architect's greatest creation. I didn't go back to bed. Sleep was a country I could no longer visit. Instead, I walked down the hallway to the room at the very end, my office. To Connor, it was just another room to be gutted and painted grega. To Lena, it was the place her father disappeared into for hours on end. But to me, this room was a sanctuary. It was my mind given physical form. I pushed open the heavy oak door and flipped on a single green glass lamp on the drafting table. The room emerged from the shadows, bathed in a soft, focused light. It smelled of old paper graphite and the faint, clean scent of oiled wood. This was the only room in the house that was entirely mine, untouched by Rose's decorative flair or Lena's modern sensibilities. The walls were not painted. They were lined from floor to ceiling with built-in shelves crammed with books on structural engineering, architectural history, Roman aqueducts, Japanese joinery, and urban planning. They were my tools, my teachers, my oldest friends. In the center of the room stood my drafting table, a vast expanse of scarred maple wood tilted at a precise angle. Its surface was a testament to a lifetime of creation covered in faint pencil lines, nicks from a slip of a knife, and the ghosts of 1,000 designs. This table was where I had designed hospitals that healed, libraries that inspired, and community centers that brought people together. It was where I had solved impossible problems of stress and load, where I had turned abstract ideas into tangible reality. This room was not a place of comfort. It was a place of power. The power of intellect, of precision, of unyielding logic. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of the drafting table. All the emotions that had been churning inside me, the hurt, The anger, the profound sadness began to recede. They were replaced by the familiar hum of a problem waiting to be solved. My mind, which had been a chaotic storm of feeling, began to organize itself, seeing not a family drama, but a structural challenge. Connor and Lena had made a critical miscalculation. They saw me as an old man, a creature of emotion and sentimentality. They had forgotten that I was an architect. I don't just see buildings, I see systems. I see the foundations hidden beneath the ground, the load-bearing walls, the stress points. I see the entire structure, and I understand better than anyone where a single precise application of pressure can bring the whole thing down. They had started a fight in my living room, a place of emotion and family. But I was going to finish it here in my office, a place of cold, hard facts. They wanted to fight over a home. I was going to change the battlefield to one of zoning laws, property deeds, and legal precedent. They had brought emotion to a battle of wills. I was about to bring mathematics. I walked over to a set of wide, flat drawers built into the wall. My archive. I pulled open a drawer labeled 142 Oak Street, primary residence. The drawer slid open with a smooth, satisfying hiss. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay the entire history of this house, told not in photographs but in blueprints, surveys, contracts, and permits. It was all here. The intellectual DNA of my home. My hands were steady now. The bandaged one was a dull ache, a reminder of the stakes. I was no longer a wounded father. I was an architect at his drafting table, and I was about to design the most important structure of my life, a fortress to protect my legacy and a perfectly engineered trap for the son-in-law who thought he could tear it down. The night was no longer an enemy, it was my colleague. It was time to get to work. Behind a false panel of bookshelves, the one containing the complete works of Vitruvius, was the safe. It was not a modern digital box, but an old, formidable piece of engineering from the 1940s with a heavy single-tumbler combination lock. I had salvaged it from a bank that was being demolished and installed it myself when I built the house. The combination was a series of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me the day I met Rose, the day Lena was born, and the architectural designation number of my very first solo project. My fingers, steady and sure, turned the dial. Left, right, left. The familiar click, solid and resonant, sounded like the workings of a great clock. The final turn, and then the heavy thud as the bolts retracted. I swung the thick steel door open. The air that came out was cool and dry, the smell of aged paper and preserved history. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry. There were only documents meticulously organized in oilcloth folders. This was my treasure, the real wealth of my life. My bandaged hand throbbed as I reached in a steady reminder of the night's insult. I pulled out the first folder. The heavy vellum paper of the original blueprints felt powerful in my hands. I unrolled them on the drafting table. The ink was still a crisp, dark black, my own handwriting sharp and precise in the margins. Every beam, every joist, every electrical outlet was there. The house's soul rendered in lines and numbers. I had designed it to last for centuries with a foundation that went deeper than code required and a structure that could withstand a hurricane. I had built it with the intention that generations of Carters would live within these walls. Connor saw it as a teardown. He had no idea what he was up against. Next, I pulled out the property deed, the original dating back to when we first bought the land. My name, Elijah Carter, and Rose Carter's name linked together. A legal testament to our partnership. I traced her beautiful flowing signature with my finger. She had been so proud that day. "We're landowners, Eli," she had said, her voice full of wonder. "We have a piece of this earth that is ours." It was more than ownership. It was a stake in the world, a claim to our place in it. For a man whose ancestors had been treated as property-owning land was an act of profound defiance and reclamation. This deed was not just a legal document. It was a declaration of freedom. I laid it next to the blueprints. Then came the geological surveys, the soil reports, the original title search that went back almost 100 years. I had insisted on the most thorough search possible before we bought it. I knew the history of this land, every owner, every transaction. I knew it better than Connor knew the details of his latest shady business deal. These papers were the roots of the house stretching deep into the past. Connor was trying to sever those roots, thinking only of the surface. He was a fool. He was so focused on the future value that he had never bothered to understand the history. And history, as I knew from my studies, was where the real power lay. I looked at the documents spread across my drafting table. They were no longer mementos of a life well lived. They had transformed. They were now exhibits, evidence, ammunition. My office was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a war room. The blueprints were my map of the terrain. The deed was my legal claim to the territory. The historical surveys were my intelligence reports. The pain in my hand had sharpened into a fine point of focus. I was no longer grieving the family I had lost. I was preparing to defend the legacy I had built. I had all the raw materials. I had the schematics, but I knew this was a battle I could not fight alone. I was an architect, not a lawyer. I needed a different kind of builder now, someone who could construct a legal argument as solid and unbreachable as the foundation of my home. Someone I could trust not just with my future, but with my past. There was only one name, one man. I looked at the old rotary phone on my desk. My fingers hovered over the dial. The night was still dark, but my path forward was illuminated as clearly as if it were drawn in white ink on a fresh blueprint. I looked at the old rotary phone on my desk. It was black and heavy, a relic from an era when things were built to last. A lot like my friendship with Jamal Coleman. In a world of disposable contacts and fleeting connections, Jamal was an institution. He was the only number I still knew by heart, the sequence of clicks and whirs as familiar to me as my own name. I picked up the heavy receiver. The dial tone was a low, steady hum, a sound of absolute reliability. My fingers found the familiar holes in the dial. J-A-M-A-L. Each pull of the wheel was a deliberate act, a summoning. We had met as two young, angry, hopeful men in the heat of the civil rights movement. We had marched together, registered voters together, and faced down dogs and fire hoses with nothing but our convictions to protect us. I had learned to build structures that could withstand physical force. He had learned to build legal arguments that could dismantle systems of injustice. We were two sides of the same coin, two builders working with different materials. I trusted him with my life because I already had more times than I could count. The phone rang on the other end. Once. Twice. On the third ring, a voice raspy with sleep but instantly recognizable answered. Yeah. It wasn't a question. It was just a sound, a confirmation of presence. Jamal, I said. It's Eli. There was a brief pause on the other end. I heard the rustle of sheets, the click of a bedside lamp. Eli, he said, his voice instantly clear, all traces of sleep gone. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Is it your heart? Should I call an ambulance? He didn't ask if everything was okay. He knew it wasn't. At our age, a call at this hour meant only one thing, the kind of trouble that couldn't wait for the sun. My heart is fine, old friend, I said, my voice steady. But my house is under siege. That was all he needed. He understood the language of conflict. He knew I didn't mean a literal siege with soldiers and cannons. I meant something worse, a battle within the family, the most brutal kind of warfare there is. Who is it? He asked, his tone shifting from concerned friend to sharp-minded lawyer. Connor, I said, and he's got Lena on his side. I heard him take a slow, deep breath. He had never liked Connor. He saw the rot under the polished surface from the very first day I introduced them. Jamal had a gift for seeing the structural flaws in people as clearly as I saw them in buildings. What did he do? Jamal asked. I looked at the white bandage on my hand, the dark spot of blood that was beginning to seep through. He made it clear that I'm no longer the owner of this house, I said. Just an occupant, a servant. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. I didn't need to tell Jamal about the glass, about the insult. He heard it all in that one word. I see, he said. And in those two words, I heard a lifetime of shared struggle, a deep understanding of what dignity meant to men like us. Don't say another word. Don't talk to them. Don't do anything. I'll be there by sunrise. We'll have coffee, and you'll tell me everything. He didn't ask if I needed him. He didn't wait for an invitation. He was already on his way. Thank you, Jamal, I said, the words feeling inadequate. Eli, he replied, and his voice was as solid as the foundation of my house. You and me, we phased down entire systems built on hate. A greedy little man in a $1,000 suit, that's not a war. That's just a demolition job. I'll see you in a few hours. He hung up. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. A wave of profound relief washed over me. The weight on my shoulders hadn't vanished, but now I was no longer carrying it alone. The first piece was on the board. The plan had officially begun. I walked to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn sky. A faint gray line was beginning to form on the horizon. The sun was coming, and so was my oldest friend. Just as the first rays of sunlight began to slice through the morning mist, I heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't the whisper of a modern luxury car like Connor's Tesla. It was a deep, throaty rumble, the sound of a well-maintained American classic. I looked out the window of my office and saw a 1975 Lincoln Continental, long and black and unapologetically old school, pull into my driveway. It parked right behind Connor's sleek white electric car, looking like a battle-scarred battleship next to a pleasure yacht. The driver's door opened and Jamal Coleman unfolded himself from the seat. He was 76 years old, but he moved with a deliberate grace that defied his age. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed not in a retiree's casual wear, but in a crisp, dark suit, a starched white shirt, and a tie. He always said, "You dress for the war you want to win, not the one you're in." At his side, he carried a worn leather briefcase that I knew contained more legal wisdom than most entire law firms. I went downstairs to meet him. As I reached the bottom step, the front door to the master suite opened and Connor emerged, dressed in expensive athletic wear. He was holding a protein shake and looked annoyed by the sound of the car. He saw me, then glanced out the front window. A look of suspicion immediately clouded his face. "Who's that?" he demanded, as if I had no right to have visitors. "An old friend," I said simply and walked to the front door. Lena came out of the kitchen looking pale and drawn. She had clearly not slept well. "Dad? Who's here?" she asked, her voice filled with anxiety. She was afraid of any variable that might upset the fragile, toxic peace she was trying to broker. I opened the door just as Jamal reached the top step. For a moment, we just looked at each other. His face was a roadmap of a life lived hard and well, his eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He glanced at my bandaged hand and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Eli," he said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded respect. "Jamal," I replied, and the relief I felt was so profound it was almost physical. I stepped aside to let him in, and that's when he came face to face with Connor, who had positioned himself in the foyer like a guard dog. "Can I help you?" Connor asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He looked Jamal up and down, taking in the old suit, the graying hair, and dismissing him as irrelevant. Jamal gave Connor a slow, measured look, the kind of look that could make a guilty man confess to crimes he hadn't even committed yet. He didn't answer Connor's question. Instead, he turned to me. "It's a beautiful morning, Eli," he said, his voice calm and steady, completely ignoring Connor's presence. He stepped into the foyer, his presence seeming to fill the entire space, diminishing Connor's. He looked around at the high ceilings, the curved staircase, his appreciative gaze taking in the details. "You did good work here, my friend," he said softly. "Real good work." Connor's face tightened with annoyance. Being ignored was an insult he couldn't stand. "This is a private residence," Connor said, stepping forward slightly. "I'm Connor Sterling, Lena's husband. And you are—" Jamal finally turned his full attention to Connor. He extended his hand, not in friendship, but as a formality, a gesture of old-world manners that was somehow more intimidating than a threat. "Jamal Coleman," he said. "A friend of the family. A very, very old friend." Connor shook his hand reluctantly. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to place Jamal to assess his level of threat. He saw an old black man in an outdated suit and decided he was none. "Well, Jamal," Connor said, trying to reclaim control, "Eli's had a rough night. He's not really up for visitors." "Oh, I'm not a visitor," Jamal said, retrieving his hand and picking up his briefcase. He looked directly into Connor's eyes, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in my son-in-law's face. "I'm his legal counsel." I led Jamal past the foyer, past the dining room with its ghost of last night's violence, and up the stairs. I didn't have to say a word. He knew where we were going. I opened the door to my office and closed it firmly behind us. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt like an act of defiance, sealing us off from the rest of the house and the poison that now flowed through it. The room, with its smell of paper and wood and its quiet, orderly logic, was a safe harbor. Here I was not an old man in his son-in-law's way. Here I was, the architect, the master of the design. Jamal did not sit down immediately. He walked around the room, his long fingers trailing over the spines of my books. He stopped at the drafting table and looked down at the documents I had laid out in the pre-dawn hours. The blueprints. The deed. He looked at them for a long time, understanding that this was the battlefield. Finally, he turned to me. "All right, Eli," he said, his voice low and even. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. And don't leave anything out." So I told him. I started with the dinner, the subtle barbs from Connor, the way he looked at my home, as if it were already his. I described the moment he slid the empty glass across the table, not a request but a command. I told him my exact words of refusal, calm and quiet. Then I told him of the explosion. I spoke the words Connor had used, the ones that had been seared into my memory. Servants must obey. Saying them out loud didn't lessen their sting. It made them more real, more vile. Jamal's face remained impassive, but I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw, a small, hard knot of anger. I held up my bandaged hand. "He threw the glass," I said. "It missed, but the point was made." Jamal nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the bandage. He understood that the real injury was not the cut on my palm. The real injury was the intent behind the throw. The worst part was still to come. "That's not why I called you Jamal," I said, my voice dropping. "Men like Connor are predictable. Their greed makes them stupid." I took a breath. It was Lena. I recounted the conversation I had overheard outside my bedroom door. I told him how she had started to defend me, but how her resolve had crumbled under Connor's manipulative pressure. I described the moment she surrendered, the moment she agreed with him, the moment her priority shifted from protecting her father to appeasing her husband. I told him about her final whispered words. "I'll talk to him. In the morning. We'll figure it out." As I spoke, I felt a profound sense of shame, as if I were confessing a failure of my own. I had raised a daughter who, when faced with a moment of true moral clarity, had chosen the path of least resistance. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Jamal didn't offer empty words of comfort. He didn't tell me Lena didn't mean it. He was a man who dealt in facts, and the facts were ugly and undeniable. He walked over to the window and looked out at the manicured lawn for a long moment, his back to me. "The betrayal of a child," he said more to himself than to me, "is the deepest cut of all." He turned back, and the look on his face was no longer that of a concerned friend. It was the look of a lawyer who had just heard the testimony that would win his case. The empathy was still there, but it was now overlaid with a cold, strategic fire. "Okay," he said, his voice crisp and decisive. "The grieving is over. Now the work begins. He called you a servant in your own home. By the time we are done, he will be begging for a place to sleep." Jamal opened his briefcase on the drafting table, and the quiet professional click of the brass latches echoed in the room. It was the sound of a craftsman opening his toolkit. As he laid out a yellow legal pad and a fountain pen, I wasn't just seeing a retired lawyer. I was seeing the same fire and focus I had first witnessed more than 50 years ago on a dusty, dangerously hot afternoon in Selma, Alabama. We were young men then, barely out of our teens, fueled by a potent combination of righteous anger and the belief that we could in fact change the world. The world at that time was doing its best to change us, to break us. We were part of a voter registration drive, a deceptively simple act that was treated like an act of war. I was the organizer, the architect of the operation. I mapped out the routes, arranged for transportation, made sure people had water and a little food. I was building a system, a process, a structure for defiance. Jamal, a brilliant, fiery law student back then, was our shield. He was the one who stood at the courthouse steps with a dog-eared copy of the Constitution in his hand, ready to argue with any registrar, any clerk, any sheriff who tried to deny our people their fundamental rights. I remember one afternoon in particular. A county sheriff, a big man with a belly that strained the buttons of his uniform and eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, strode up to our group. He was flanked by 2 deputies, their hands resting on their holstered sidearms. He was a walking embodiment of oppressive power, and he was used to people crumbling before him. He came right up to Jamal, trying to use his physical size to intimidate him. "You boys are causing a disturbance," the sheriff drawled, his voice thick with menace. "I think it's time y'all packed up and went home." The people in line behind us grew quiet. The fear was a palpable thing, thick as the summer humidity. But Jamal didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked the sheriff in the eye. "With all due respect, Sheriff, Jamal said, his voice as calm and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "We are exercising our rights as citizens under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Johnson. We are not causing a disturbance. We are participating in democracy." He had this way of using the law not as a shield, but as a sword, turning his opponent's authority back on them. The sheriff's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He was a man of brute force, and he was being confronted with an intellectual force he couldn't comprehend or overpower. "You got a smart mouth on you, boy," he snarled. Jamal just smiled a thin, dangerous smile. "That's what my law professors tell me." I was standing right beside him. I wasn't a lawyer and I wasn't a fighter. I was a builder. But in that moment, I put my hand on Jamal's shoulder. A small act of solidarity. A silent promise that if this man went down, I was going down with him. The sheriff held our gaze for a long, tense moment, then spat on the ground and walked away. Defeated, not by a weapon, but by a well-articulated paragraph of federal law. That was the day our friendship was truly forged. Not in a classroom or a neighborhood, but in the crucible of a righteous fight. We learned that day that there are different kinds of power. There is the loud, bullying power of men like that sheriff and men like Connor, and then there is the quiet, unshakable power of knowing the rules, of standing on a foundation of truth and law. Looking at Jamal now, an old man in my office, I saw that same quiet power. The enemy had changed. The battlefield had moved from a dusty courthouse square to this mahogany-paneled room. The weapons were no longer protest signs, but property deeds and legal trusts. But the nature of the fight was exactly the same. It was a fight for dignity. A fight against a bully who believed his power made him immune to the rules. Jamal looked up from his legal pad, his eyes meeting mine. "Now, Eli," he said, the pen poised in his hand, "let's talk about the architecture of this house, not the wood and the stone. I want to know about the paper. Tell me about the foundation of your ownership." The war had begun. Jamal paced the length of the office, once his hands clasped behind his back. It was not a nervous gesture. It was the way a general surveys a map before a battle, absorbing the terrain, calculating the risks. He was a man comfortable with the silence that follows a terrible truth. He didn't offer platitudes. He processed information. Finally, he stopped at the drafting table, placing his hands flat on the original blueprints. He wasn't seeing a drawing of a house. He was looking at a map of the battlefield. "Okay," he said, his voice now devoid of all emotion except a cold, hard focus. "Connor's a developer. He's a man who deals in facts, figures, and leverage. He thinks he has all the leverage here. Our job is to prove him wrong. We're going to dismantle his position piece by piece, starting with the foundation." His finger tapped the title deed. "Let's start here. The deed. Whose names are on it right now today?" "Mine," I said. "It was in my name and Rose's name as joint tenants with right of survivorship. When she passed, it became solely mine. And Lena's name is not on the title in any capacity." "No, never." Jamal made a note on his legal pad, a single sharp check mark. "Good. That's our high ground. Absolute ownership. Now finances. The mortgage was paid off years ago, I assume." 22 years ago. I confirmed. "I burned the mortgage papers in a little ceremony in the backyard. Rose thought it was dramatic." A faint smile touched Jamal's lips. "Rose was always the sensible one. What about property taxes?" "Paid in full every year from my own pension and investment accounts. I have the records going back 3 decades. "Utilities, insurance, maintenance," he pressed. "All me," I said. "Connor pays for nothing related to this property. He and Lena buy the groceries when they're here, and he pays for the expensive whiskey he likes to drink. But the house, the land, its upkeep, that has always been my responsibility." Jamal made another series of notes. "Excellent. So we can immediately dismantle any argument that he is supporting you or has any financial claim to this property. He is a guest. Nothing more." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "Your will, Eli. What does it say?" The question was blunt but necessary. "As it stands now," I said, the words feeling heavy, "the house and the majority of my estate go to Lena." Jamal looked up, his eyes sharp. "Does Connor know this?" "I imagine he does. Lena and I discussed it years ago." "Then that's his endgame," Jamal said, the pieces clicking into place. "He's not just trying to push you out. He's waiting to cash in. He's playing the long game. The disrespect, the insults, He's trying to wear you down, make you feel like a burden, maybe even create a situation where he can make a case for you being incompetent to manage your own affairs. The word incompetent hung in the air cold and ugly. It was exactly what they were doing. He's a developer, Jamal continued, thinking aloud. He's looked at the zoning, the property value, the market trends. He's done his due diligence from a business perspective. But men like him have a blind spot. They only look at the surface. They rarely dig into the history. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. So you have to tell me, Eli, is there anything about this property, anything in its history, its legal status, its very bones, that a man like Connor would never think to look for? Before we could look for secrets hidden in the property's history, Jamal insisted we first look at the present. Connor is a man of his time, Eli, he said, tapping the screen of his modern smartphone, which looked out of place next to my rotary phone. His plans, his conspiracies, they won't be written on parchment. They'll be in the cloud, in emails, text messages, financial records. He thinks he's untouchable, which means he's careless. We need to find his digital trail. The idea felt invasive, a step into a world of espionage I didn't belong in. But Jamal was right. To fight a modern enemy, you had to use modern weapons. The problem was I had no access to their world. I didn't know their passwords. I didn't use their computers. I was locked out. There's no way in Jamal, I said, a sense of defeat creeping into my voice. Their life is a fortress of passwords and encryption. Jamal looked at me, a shrewd glint in his eye. Every fortress has a forgotten door, Eli, a service entrance. Think, is there any financial connection you still have with Lena? Any account, no matter how old, where your name is still linked to hers? And then it came to me, a memory from decades ago. A younger me full of pride and hope sitting in a bank office with a 5-year-old Lena who was more interested in the lollipop the manager gave her than the papers I was signing. The trust, I said, my voice barely a whisper. When Lena was born, I set up an educational trust fund for her. I put a significant amount of my savings into it to ensure she would never have to worry about college tuition. I am the primary trustee. Jamal's face broke into a slow, grim smile. And, he prompted, and I continued, the pieces falling into place. When she got married, she linked the trust account to their main household financial management platform for transparency, she said. I still have trustee access, online access. Jamal snapped his briefcase shut. That's it, he said with an air of finality. That's our way in. He built a wall around their life, but he left the one door I built standing wide open. Get your computer, Eli. I felt a pang of guilt as I sat down at the old desktop computer in my office. This felt like a violation of Lena's privacy. But then the memory of her whispered words outside my door came back to me cold and sharp. She had already violated the sacred trust between a father and a child. This was no longer about privacy. This was about survival. It took a few tries to remember the password. It was Rose and Lena 1987, the year Rose had finally beaten cancer for the first time. The irony was bitter. Logging in felt like stepping through a portal into their lives. It was all there, laid out in neat columns and colorful charts. Their income, their investments, their extravagant spending. Expensive vacations, car payments for 2 luxury vehicles, charges at restaurants I had never heard of. It was a portrait of a life lived on a scale I could barely comprehend. Jamal stood behind me, looking over my shoulder. He wasn't interested in their lifestyle. He was looking for anomalies. Ignore the big stuff, he said, his voice a low murmur. Look for the small regular payments. Look for things that don't fit. Retainers, consulting fees, anything that smells like a professional service. For an hour we scrolled through months of transactions. It was a dizzying, numbing list of their wealth. And then I saw it. A recurring monthly payment, not large, just a few $100s. It was to a firm named Sterling Oak Advisory Group. What's that? Jamal asked, pointing at the screen. I've never heard of it, I said. Jamal pulled out his phone and typed in the name. His eyes narrowed as he read the results. Well, well, he said softly. This is interesting. Sterling Oak Advisory Group isn't a financial advisory. They're a boutique legal consultancy. And their specialty, he turned the phone screen to me, is estate litigation and contested guardianship. The words hit me like a physical blow. Contested guardianship. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively building a case to have me declared mentally incompetent. This wasn't a vague, greedy hope for the future. It was a cold, calculated, ongoing legal strategy, and my daughter was paying for it. "The bastards," I whispered, the room suddenly feeling very cold. Jamal put a hand on my shoulder. "We've got him, Eli," he said, his voice hard as iron. "We've found the first thread. Now we just have to pull on it and watch his whole world unravel." The name of the law firm hung in the air between us. Sterling Oak Advisory Group. It sounded so respectable, so benign. But its specialty contested guardianship was the legal equivalent of a back-alley knife fight. It was a strategy designed to strip a person not just of their assets, but of their autonomy, their voice, their very identity. "They're building a cage for you, Eli," Jamal said, his voice a low growl. "A legal cage padded with false concern and medical jargon, but a cage nonetheless. And they're doing it right under your nose." My first instinct was denial. Lena wouldn't be a part of something so monstrous. She wouldn't, but the evidence, the recurring payment, was a cold, hard fact. "We need more than a payment," Jamal said, his mind already 3 steps ahead. "We need the blueprints for their cage. Let's search the email archives linked to this platform. A man as arrogant as Connor probably uses the same keywords over and over." My hands felt heavy on the keyboard. With Jamal guiding me, I navigated to the search function of the linked email account. I typed in the name of the law firm, Sterling Oak. My finger hovered over the enter key for a moment. I was about to cross a line from which there was no return to deliberately seek out the proof of my daughter's ultimate betrayal. I pressed the key. The results loaded instantly. Not one email. A chain. A thread of correspondence going back almost a year. The subject line was chilling in its corporate sterility, Carter estate strategy. I clicked on the most recent email. It was from Connor to a lawyer named Davies. I read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The email was a list, a meticulously documented log of my supposed failings. June 12th, Eli forgot the name of his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable. Had to be reminded twice. June 18th, repeated the same story about his first big architectural project 3 times during dinner. July 2nd, misplaced his car keys for over an hour, became agitated and accused Lena of moving them. I remembered each of those moments. I had forgotten Mrs. Gable's name because I had been thinking about Rose. I had repeated the story because I was proud of it, and I wanted my daughter to understand a part of my life she had never known. I had misplaced my keys because I was 75 years old, and sometimes I misplaced my damn keys. They weren't signs of dementia. They were signs of a life lived, of a mind filled with 75 years of memories, triumphs, and sorrows. But here in the cold, clinical text of an email, my life was being reframed. My memories were being weaponized against me. My very human imperfections were being collected like specimens and pinned to a board labeled as evidence of my decline. This was not just an invasion of my privacy. It was a digital autopsy of my life performed while I was still living it. I scrolled down, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw the lawyer's replies. Cautious, encouraging, and utterly devoid of humanity. "This is excellent documentation, Mr. Sterling. A consistent pattern is key. It would also be beneficial to have a third-party medical opinion at the appropriate time. We can discuss strategies for that on our next call." They were creating a narrative, a fiction designed to be presented in court. The story of a confused old man who was no longer capable of managing his own affairs, who needed to be protected from himself. A man whose beautiful historic home would be much better off managed by his caring, responsible son-in-law. It was the most profound kind of gaslighting, a conspiracy to make me doubt my own mind. And then I saw it. The final devastating blow. At the bottom of the email chain below Connor's signature was the list of recipients who had been copied on the message. My eyes scanned past the lawyer's name and landed on the second entry, Lena Sterling. It wasn't just her name, it was her work email address, the one from the prestigious law firm where she was a partner. This was not a passive, reluctant participant. This was a lawyer my daughter actively included in a legal strategy to strip me of my rights. Every condescending question she'd asked me in the past year. "Dad, are you sure you should be driving at night? Did you remember to take your medication?" flashed in my mind. They weren't questions born of concern. They were interrogations, data collection for their case. I felt the air leave my lungs. I was a ghost in my own life, being observed, documented, and prepared for my own legal burial. The betrayal was so complete, so monstrous, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. A part of me, a foolish, desperate father's heart, clung to a sliver of hope. Maybe she didn't read them. Maybe Connor just copied her on the emails as a form of intimidation to create the illusion of a united front. She was busy, a partner at a major law firm. She probably just deleted them without reading, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of her correspondence. It was a flimsy shield, but it was the only one I had left to protect the memory of the daughter I loved. "We don't know if she's an active participant," I said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Being copied on an email isn't the same as writing one. Jamal looked at me with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He knew I needed to see it for myself. He knew that for me to fully commit to this fight, there could be no doubt left. None at all. "Okay, Eli," he said gently. "Let's refine the search. Search for emails sent from her address with your name or father or the house in the body." My hands trembled slightly as I typed in the new search parameters. From Lena, sterling@lawfirm.com, contains father. I hit enter. This time only one result appeared. It was an email from Lena to Connor sent about 6 months ago. The subject line was simply, "Following up." It was a reply to the very email chain we had just been reading, the one where the lawyer discussed the strategy for proving my incompetence. My heart felt like a stone in my chest. This was it, the point of no return. I clicked it open. The email was short, only a few paragraphs, but in those few paragraphs, the last of my illusions were systematically and brutally demolished. Her words were not the words of a monster. They were worse. They were the words of a careful, considerate, and thoroughly rational person justifying a monstrous act. "Connor," she had written, "I've reviewed the latest correspondence from Davies. I agree that a consistent record is the most effective approach. The legal strategy is sound." That first sentence was a stab wound. She hadn't just read the emails. She had reviewed them. As a lawyer, she had given her professional seal of approval to the plan to have me declared legally incompetent. She was not a victim of her husband's manipulation. She was a co-conspirator. I read on my vision blurring slightly. "My only concern," she continued, "is the emotional impact on my father. He is a proud man, and if he feels like he is being attacked or managed, he will shut down completely. We need to be delicate. This has to be framed as an act of love, of concern for his well-being. The transition must be handled in a way that causes the least amount of pain and preserves his dignity as much as possible." I had to read that last line twice. Preserves his dignity. She was discussing how to gently and lovingly place a leash around my neck. She was strategizing the most humane way to put me in a cage. She wasn't fighting the plan. She was trying to refine it to make it more palatable to manage her own conscience while still achieving the desired result. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was willing to strip me of my home, my autonomy, and my legal rights, but she wanted to do it nicely. She wanted to be able to tell herself that she had done it for my own good. It was the ultimate betrayal because it was cloaked in the language of love. It was a betrayal so profound that it warped the very meaning of the words she used. In her world, love meant control. Dignity meant a comfortable confinement. Concern meant meticulously documenting my every moment of human frailty to use against me in a court of law. I leaned back in my chair, the strength gone from my limbs. I felt a deep, hollowing emptiness. The daughter I had raised, the little girl I had read bedtime stories to, the brilliant woman I had been so proud of, she was gone. In her place was this stranger, this cold-eyed strategist who spoke of preserving my dignity while sharpening the knife that would sever it forever. Jamal placed a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm grounding. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a silent witness to the moment my heart finally, irrevocably broke. "Now you know," he said after a long silence. "Now there are no more ghosts, no more doubts." I looked at the screen at my daughter's name, at her carefully chosen, devastatingly cruel words. "Yes," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Now I know." The shield was gone. There was nothing left to protect. There was only the fight. Jamal's legal mind immediately saw the next move. The guardianship plot is just the key to the door, Eli, he said, his voice low and intense. What we need to see is what's on the other side of that door. What is the grand prize he's willing to destroy your family for? Let's search for business documents. Look for file attachments, PDFs, presentations, spreadsheets. Search for words like development, prospectus, zoning, Project Oak. The name Project Oak was a guess, a logical leap based on the law firm's name and the old oak tree in my front yard. It was a depressingly corporate and unsentimental name for a plan to destroy my home. I typed the words into the search bar, my fingers feeling like clumsy foreign objects. The system churned for a moment, and then a new list of files populated the screen. They were not emails. They were attachments stored in their cloud drive. My heart sank as I read the file names. Project Oak, Financial Projections, XLOX. Project Oak, Investor Deck PPTX. Project Oak, Architectural Renderings Final.pdf. It was all there, an entire business plan hidden in plain sight. Open the renderings first, Jamal said. I clicked on the PDF file. It took a moment to load, and then a glossy, hyper-realistic image of a building filled the screen. It was a building I had never seen before, yet it stood on the one piece of land I knew better than any other on Earth. It was a sleek, modern, 5-story block of glass and steel. Solace, anonymous. It rose from the very spot where my house Rose's garden and the ancient oak tree now stood. In the bottom right corner of the rendering, in an elegant stylized font, were the words, "The Sterling at Oak Street, Luxury Residences." He was going to put his own name on the tombstone of my life. I felt a wave of nausea. This was not an abstract idea anymore. This was a fully realized vision. I could see the balconies where strangers would stand, the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a view that was once mine alone. I clicked through the document, page after page of renderings. The lobby with its minimalist furniture and generic art. The rooftop pool surrounded by people who looked like they were from a catalog. There was no trace of my home, no hint that a life had ever been lived here. It was a complete and total erasure. Now the investor deck, Jamal said, his voice grim. I opened the presentation file. The first slide was a picture of my house taken on a beautiful spring day, the roses in full bloom. Above the picture was the headline, "Prime Real Estate Opportunity in Atlanta's Most Sought-After Neighborhood." He was using a photograph of my home, my life, as a marketing tool to sell its destruction. I felt a rage so pure and cold it almost took my breath away. I clicked through the slides. There were maps showing the property's proximity to expensive private schools and country clubs. There were charts with projected revenue streams and profit margins. It was a multi-million-dollar plan. He wasn't just planning to sell the house. He was planning to leverage it into a massive development project that would make him a fortune. He had valued the land, my home, at over $10 million as a development site. The numbers were staggering. But the most damning evidence was in the financial spreadsheet. Jamal, who was as adept at reading a balance sheet as he was a legal brief, pointed to a series of entries. "Look here," he said. "He's already taken out bridge loans against the projected value of this development. He's using your house as collateral for a project that doesn't even exist yet. He's financing his other failing businesses with the ghost of your home." It all snapped into focus. The pressure, the urgency, the escalating disrespect. It wasn't just about greed. It was about desperation. Connor wasn't just building an empire. He was trying to stop his current one from collapsing. He was using my legacy as a life raft. The sheer audacity of it was stunning. He had built an entire financial house of cards on a foundation of property that he did not own, based on a legal strategy to have me declared incompetent that had not yet succeeded. This was not just a family dispute anymore. This had crossed the line into outright fraud. I looked at the glossy rendering of the Sterling again. My rage was gone, replaced by a crystalline resolve. He had made a fatal mistake. He had put his entire plan in writing. He had created the very blueprints of his own destruction, and he had left them in a place where the one man he had underestimated, the architect of the very house he planned to destroy, could find them. I pushed back from the computer, a slow, deliberate movement. The glossy renderings and damning spreadsheets on the screen seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The rage I had felt moments before, that clean, hot fire, was gone. It had been extinguished by a flood of something far colder and more desolate: grief. It was a grief so profound it felt like a physical death. The death of my daughter. Not her body, but the idea of her, the memory of the little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the brilliant young woman I had proudly watched graduate from law school. That Lena was gone. This new Lena, this co-conspirator who could calmly discuss the preservation of my dignity while actively plotting its demolition, was a stranger, an enemy who wore my daughter's face. Jamal was silent. He knew this was a moment that required no words, a wound that no platitude could soothe. He simply stood as a witness. My mind, unbidden, retreated from the cold reality of the computer screen and sought refuge in the past. I saw Lena, 7 years old, sitting on a stool in my workshop. I was building a small, intricate model of a bridge, and she was watching me, her eyes wide with wonder. "Why do you have to be so careful with the little pieces, Daddy?" she had asked, her small voice echoing in the quiet space. I remember stopping my work and looking at her. "Because, sweetheart," I had told her, "a bridge is built on trust. Every single piece has to trust the piece next to it to do its job. If one piece is weak or dishonest, the whole thing comes crashing down." Integrity isn't just about the big visible parts. It's about the smallest, most hidden details. She had nodded seriously, as if she understood the profound weight of that lesson. "Integrity, Daddy," she had repeated, testing the word in her mouth. Where was that little girl now? When had she forgotten that lesson? When had she decided that it was okay for a single dishonest piece to compromise the entire structure of our family? The pain was a physical thing. It was a pressure in my chest, a hollowness in the pit of my stomach. Connor's betrayal was a simple, ugly thing like a crack in a wall. It was a problem to be fixed. But Lena's betrayal was a flaw in the foundation. It meant the entire structure. Everything I thought I had built over a lifetime was unstable, rotten from the ground up. I had poured my life into her, into giving her the security and opportunities I never had. I had built this house to be her anchor, her refuge, the place she could always come home to. And she had looked at this gift, this testament to a lifetime of love and sacrifice, and seen only its monetary value. She had allied herself with a man who saw her father as a servant and her childhood home as a development opportunity. She had not been corrupted by him. The corruption was already there, latent, waiting for the right opportunity to bloom. That was the most painful realization of all. This was not an aberration. This was who she was. I closed my eyes and saw the email again, her carefully crafted professional words discussing my fate. Least amount of pain. Preserves his dignity. The clinical detached language was 1,000 times more cruel than Connor's brutish rage. He was an honest monster. She was something far more dangerous, a monster who believed she was an angel of mercy. I finally understood. The fight was not about the house anymore. The house was just a symbol. This was a fight for the truth. It was a fight for the memory of Rose, who would have been utterly destroyed by this. It was a fight for the little girl on the stool in my workshop, the one who still believed in integrity. I owed it to them to see this through. I owed it to myself. I opened my eyes and looked at Jamal. The grief was still there, a permanent ache I would carry for the rest of my days. But something else had taken root beside it. A cold, hard resolve as unyielding as granite. The architect in me had taken over. The emotional structure of my family had failed. It had collapsed into ruin. Now all that was left was to build something new in its place. Something made not of love and trust, but of law and consequences. "Okay," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Let's get to work. Show me the blueprints for his destruction." The grief was a physical weight, but it was not paralyzing. It was clarifying. All the love and warmth I had for my daughter had been transmuted into something else. Something harder, something I could build with. I turned back to the computer, saved the incriminating files to a small encrypted flash drive, and then methodically permanently deleted the search history and cleared the cache. I closed the portal into their lives and logged out. The act felt final. I had seen the truth, and now I was sealing the door behind me. I turned to Jamal. The look on his face was one of profound sorrow for my loss, but also of a grim professional readiness. He was no longer just my friend. He was my general, and he was waiting for his orders. "All right, Jamal," I said, my voice low but steady. "They have their strategy. Now let me show you mine. Connor has looked at this house and seen its market value. Lena has looked at it and seen it as a marital complication. They have both failed to see what it truly is. I walked over to the grand fireplace that dominated one wall of my office. The mantel was a single massive piece of dark-aged timber, its surface covered with the nicks and scars of a previous life. Connor thinks I built this house with brick and mortar, I said, running my hand over the rough-hewn wood. He's wrong. I looked at Jamal. This house is built with ghosts. Jamal raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He knew me well enough to know I was not speaking in metaphors. When I was a young architect just starting out in Atlanta, the city was changing. Urban renewal, they called it. But what it really was a war on our history. They were tearing down entire blocks of the old black business districts, Sweet Auburn, the West End, historic churches, community halls, theaters, businesses that had been the bedrock of our world for generations. All of it turned to dust to make way for highways and parking lots. I could see the memory of it in Jamal's eyes. He had been there too. He had fought it in the courts while I watched it happen from the construction sites. I was a junior draftsman on some of those demolition projects. I continued, my voice hardening. It was soul-crushing work. Watching them take a wrecking ball to a building that had survived riots and depressions, a place where legends had walked. It felt like a desecration. So I started doing something, secretly at first. I would go to the sites before the demolition crews arrived. I'd talk to the foreman, slip him a few dollars, and I would salvage what I could. A hand-carved newel post from a boarding house that had sheltered black travelers, oak floorboards from a dance hall where people had found joy in a segregated world, the bricks from the chimney of the first black-owned printing press in the city. I pointed to the fireplace mantel. This piece of timber. This was a support beam from the Ebenezer Baptist Church's original community hall, the one they tore down in the 60s. I have the records. I have the photographs. I walked over to the wall lined with my books and pulled on a section of shelving. It swung inward, revealing not a safe, but a hidden climate-controlled archive. Inside were carefully labeled boxes and files. This isn't just a house, Jamal, I said, my voice filled with a passion I thought had died. It's an ark. Every piece of salvaged material has a story of provenance. The wrought iron on the main staircase came from a pharmacy owned by one of the city's first black doctors. The stained glass in the foyer is from a church that was firebombed in the 50s. I didn't build a home. I built a living museum, a testament to a history they tried to erase. Jamal stepped into the archive, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound reverence. He ran a hand over a box labeled Rivoli Theater, box office trim. My God, Eli, he whispered. I had my first date at the Rivoli. He looked at me, and for the first time that morning I saw a flicker of something that wasn't pity or anger. It was awe. He finally understood. You didn't just build a house, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You built a monument. Exactly, I said, closing the archive door. And Connor Sterling, with his plans for luxury condos, isn't just trying to evict an old man. He's planning to take a wrecking ball to a piece of our history. Again. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Jamal's face. He understood the moral power of what I had just revealed. That's a beautiful story, Eli, he said. A powerful one. It gives us the moral high ground, but a story won't win a fight in a courtroom. I know, I said. That was just the first secret. I walked back to my desk and picked up a single, unassuming file folder. This, I said, holding it up, is the second. This is the one that will turn his entire world to dust. You're right, Jamal, I began, my voice quiet but firm. The story gives us the moral high ground. It gives us a narrative that no jury, no judge, no newspaper reporter could ignore. But you and I both know that the moral high ground doesn't stop a bulldozer. I slid the unassuming manila folder across the smooth surface of the drafting table. It came to a stop just in front of him. This, however, does. Jamal looked at the folder, then at me. His expression was cautious, expectant. What is it? He asked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the moment hang in the air. This was the culmination of a plan that had been dormant for a decade and a half, a strategic move I had made long ago, driven by a flicker of intuition that I had never spoken of to anyone, not even Rose. I had to take him back to that moment. About 15 years ago. I said Connor and Lena had been married for a couple of years. He was just starting to make a name for himself in real estate. He came for dinner one night, and he was walking around the garden with me. He made a comment. It was slick casual disguised as a compliment. "This is a hell of a plot of land, Eli," he'd said. "The value here isn't in the house, it's in the footprint. You're sitting on a gold mine." I brushed it off at the time, but that night I couldn't sleep. The word footprint echoed in my mind. He didn't see a home. He saw an outline on a map where something bigger and more profitable could be built. Rose had seen the worry on my face. "He makes you nervous," she had said. It wasn't a question. "He doesn't see what we see," I had told her. And she had replied with the words that set everything in motion. "Then you have to make sure he can never tear it down, Eli. You have to protect its story." The next day I began my research, and I used the house's first secret to create the second. I submitted a formal application to the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. Jamal's eyes widened. He leaned forward, his entire body suddenly alert a predator sensing a kill. I provided them with a complete architectural history of this house. I continued tapping the folder. I documented the provenance of every major salvaged element. The support beam from the Ebenezer Community Hall, the ironwork from the pharmacy, the bricks from the printing press. I submitted my photographs, my archival records, everything. It took 2 years. They sent historians. They sent architectural experts. They crawled through the attic and the basement. They verified every single claim I made. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. And then 13 years ago, I received their final decision. I nodded towards the folder. "Go on, open it." With a sense of reverence, Jamal untied the string on the folder and opened it. Inside was not one document, but a thick stack of them. Correspondence reports, official letterheads. But on the very top was a single heavy vellum certificate embossed with the gold seal of the state of Georgia. Jamal lifted it out as if it were a sacred text. He read the words aloud, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. "By the authority of the State of Georgia Historic Preservation Division, the property at 142 Oak Street, Atlanta, known as the Carter House, is hereby officially designated as a state historic landmark, protected under state preservation statutes." He trailed off, his eyes scanning the rest of the document. He looked up at me, his face a mask of utter, unadulterated shock, and then his expression shifted. The shock gave way to a slow, dawning, brilliant, and absolutely ferocious smile. "You magnificent old bastard!" He breathed the words full of awe. A deep, booming laugh erupted from his chest, a sound of pure, triumphant joy. "They can't touch it," he said, slapping the table. "They can't tear it down. They can't alter the facade." My God, Eli. They probably can't even replace a window without a full review by the Preservation Board. Selling it for commercial development is not just difficult, it's legally impossible. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in wonder. "This whole time," he said, gesturing around the room, "I thought you were living in a house. You've been living in a legal fortress, a time bomb. And you set the timer for 15 years just waiting for someone to trip the wire." I gave a small, grim nod. The relief was immense, but there was no joy in it for me, only a cold, hard satisfaction. Connor's entire multi-million-dollar business plan, his fraudulent loans, his whole house of cards, I said was built on a foundation of sand. He did all his due diligence on market value and zoning potential, but he never thought to check the one thing that mattered. He never thought to check the history. He never imagined that the old servant he was planning to evict had made a chess move 15 years ago and had been waiting patiently for him to walk right into checkmate. The euphoria of the revelation faded, replaced by Jamal's intense professional focus. The triumphant laughter subsided, and the lawyer reemerged more dangerous than ever. "A fortress is only as good as its walls, Eli," he said, his voice dropping back into a serious, analytical tone. "The certificate is the flag we fly from the battlements. Now let's read the fine print. Let's understand the exact composition of the stone in these walls." For the next hour, my office, my sanctuary of design and memory, was transformed into a high-stakes legal library. We spread the documents from the preservation office across the entire surface of the drafting table, covering the old blueprints of my home with the new blueprints of its legal defense. Jamal read every line of the state preservation statutes, every clause, every subsection. His fountain pen scratched across his yellow legal pad, underlining key phrases, making notes in the margins. It was a masterclass in legal deconstruction. I, in turn, read them from the perspective of an architect understanding the practical, physical implications of the legal jargon. It was a perfect fusion of our two minds. Here it is, Jamal said, his finger jabbing at a paragraph in a dense, single-spaced document. Section 4, subsection C. Demolition of a designated state historic landmark is strictly prohibited, except in cases where the structure is deemed an imminent threat to public safety by a state-certified engineer and approved by a unanimous vote of the Preservation Board. He looked up at me, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. This house has a foundation I could land a 747 on. It's not an imminent threat to anything but Connor's bank account. So the primary goal of his entire Project Oak demolition is dead on arrival. He can't tear it down. Period. That was the main wall of the fortress. But Jamal was looking for the battlements, the traps. It gets better. He continued, scanning further down the page. Subsection E, any alteration, restoration, or addition to the exterior facade, including but not limited to changes in materials, windows, doors, or roofline, must be submitted for review and must be deemed historically appropriate by the Architectural Review Committee. I felt a smile touch my own lips for the first time. The Architectural Review Committee for this district is chaired by a woman named Dr. Althea Jacobs, I said. She's a brilliant historian and a pit bull when it comes to preserving Atlanta's architectural integrity. She would rather set herself on fire than approve a glass and steel condo. Jamal let out a low whistle. So he can't tear it down, and he can't change the way it looks. What about the land itself? The footprint he was so interested in. He found the relevant section a moment later. Here we are. Section 7. Subdivision of the designated property plot is prohibited. Any new construction on the grounds must not impede the historical sight lines of the landmark from the primary public thoroughfare. He can't chop up the lot, Jamal translated, and he can't build anything in the front yard that would block the view of the house from the street, which, given the layout, means he can't build anything at all. He leaned back, the full scope of the legal protections laid bare before us. My secret 15-year-old plan was more perfect, more complete than I had even dared to hope. It was an ironclad, hermetically sealed legal masterpiece. Connor's multi-million-dollar prospectus, his glossy renderings, his fraudulent bridge loans secured against a fantasy, all of it was rendered utterly worthless by these few pages of dry, bureaucratic text. Jamal tapped his pen on the investor deck. I had found the one with the picture of my house on the cover. This piège, he said, has now crossed a line. This is no longer just a family dispute or a matter of inheritance. This document is proof of felony fraud. He has secured financial loans based on a development plan that is legally impossible to execute. He has presented a fraudulent prospectus to potential investors. He hasn't just been disrespectful, Eli. He has been committing serious prosecutable crimes. The weight of that statement settled in the room. This was bigger than I had imagined. I had wanted to protect my home. I had wanted to teach a lesson in respect. But the trap I had set was far more potent than I knew. It was not just a shield to defend myself, it was a weapon that could utterly destroy him. He has no idea, I said softly, looking at the certificate with the golden seal. He walks around this house every day, sleeping under this roof, plotting its destruction, and he has no idea that he is living inside the very evidence that can send him to prison. Jamal began to gather the papers, a new cold sense of purpose in his movements. No, he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. He has no idea, but he's about to. The planning phase is over, my friend. It's time to schedule the demolition, his demolition. The legal documents were no longer just a shield, they were a script, and now it was time for the first actor to take the stage. I looked at Jamal, who gave me a slow, decisive nod. The moment was here. I reached for the old rotary phone, but Jamal gently pushed his sleek smartphone across the desk towards me. No, Eli, he said. Use this. I want a digital record of this call with a timestamp. From this moment forward, we create a new paper trail. A clean one. I picked up the phone. It felt alien in my hand, too light, too fragile. But I understood the logic. I found the contact for the State Historic Preservation Office in my files and dialed the number. The sterile digital tones were a stark contrast to the satisfying whir of my old phone. It was the sound of a new kind of war. Georgia Historic Preservation Office, this is Brenda speaking. How may I direct your call? A cheerful voice answered. I'd like to speak with Dr. Althea Jacobs, please. I said, my voice calm and professional. Elijah Carter calling. I was put on a brief hold, the phone playing a tinny, synthesized version of a Mozart piece. Jamal stood by the window, watching, listening, his arms crossed. He was letting me take the lead. This was my area of expertise. Elijah. What a pleasant surprise. A new voice, sharp and energetic, came on the line. It was Dr. Jacobs. I was just reviewing your file the other day during a grant application review. The Carter House is still one of my favorite designations. A true act of architectural preservation. To what do I owe the pleasure? It's good to hear your voice, Althea. I said, a genuine warmth in my tone. I'm calling today, unfortunately, on a matter of some concern regarding the property. I could almost hear her sit up straighter in her chair. Concern? She asked, the professional curiosity in her voice immediately apparent. Has there been some damage to the structure? No, nothing like that. The house is as solid as the day it was built, I reassured her. The concern is external. I've recently been subjected to some rather aggressive and unsolicited inquiries from real estate developers regarding the sale of the property for a large-scale commercial project. I chose my words with care. I was not a distressed old man complaining about his family. I was the custodian of a historic landmark, formally reporting a potential threat to its integrity. I see, Dr. Jacobs said, her voice turning from warm to icy. And have you reminded these developers of the property's landmark status and the legal protections that entails? I have, I said, but their persistence suggests they either don't understand the full legal ramifications, or more worryingly, they believe the designation can be challenged or overturned. This was the key phrase, the one Jamal and I had rehearsed. It suggested a legal threat which would trigger an institutional response. Challenged, Dr. Jacobs' voice was laced with a professional indignation that I found deeply satisfying. The Carter House designation is ironclad, Elijah. It's a textbook example of a site with unique architectural and cultural significance. Any such challenge would be legally frivolous and an utter waste of time. That's very reassuring to hear, Althea, I said. Nevertheless, the pressure is becoming considerable, and it made me realize that perhaps the property's status isn't as publicly visible as it should be. There was a pause on the other end of the line as she processed this. You're right, she said finally. We often find that a clear physical deterrent is the most effective tool against predatory development. Your file indicates that the official state-issued bronze landmark plaque was never installed. At the time, you opted against it for privacy reasons. My circumstances have changed, Althea, I said simply. I believe the time has come for the house to publicly declare what it is. I couldn't agree more, she said with renewed energy. It's not just a deterrent, it's a celebration of the property's history. I can have a survey and installation team out there as early as tomorrow evening. They'll need to take some measurements and determine the most historically appropriate placement. Would that work for you? A slow, cold wave of satisfaction washed over me. It was more than I had hoped for. Tomorrow evening would be perfect, I said, keeping my voice level. Excellent. I'll put in the work order immediately. And Elijah, thank you for being such a vigilant steward of our state's history. Don't you worry about those developers. Let them come. We're ready for them. I thanked her and ended the call. I placed the phone back on the desk. The first move had been made. The first piece was advancing across the board. The stage was being set. The actors for the final scene had just been summoned. All that was left was for the audience, an audience of one unsuspecting, arrogant son-in-law, to wake up and find that the play had begun without him. While Jamal and I sat in the quiet of my office, the house wrapped in a profound and waiting silence, I knew another scene was playing out across town. I didn't have to be there to see it. I could build it in my mind with the same precision I used to design a building because I knew the materials. I knew the arrogance of my son-in-law and the practiced grace of my daughter. In a gilded ballroom downtown, under the glittering light of a dozen crystal chandeliers, they were performing. It was some charity gala, the kind of event where the city's powerful pretend to have a conscience for one night a year. Connor would be in his element, a shark in a tuxedo, gliding through the murmur of money and influence. I could see him, a glass of champagne in one hand, the other gesturing expansively as he held court with a circle of older, wealthier men. Men who built their fortunes on foundations I wouldn't trust to hold a shed. He would be selling them a fantasy, not just a building, but an idea. He'd be using words like exclusive legacy and unprecedented returns. He would be showing them the glossy renderings on his phone, the sleek glass tower that would replace my home. He would be peddling a ghost, and they, blinded by the promise of profit, would see only a masterpiece of modern investment. He wouldn't be doing it alone. Lena would be at his side, a vision in a silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She would be his greatest asset. She would laugh at the investor's jokes, her smile warm and genuine. She would use her legal pedigree and her quiet intelligence to lend an air of unimpeachable respectability to the entire fraudulent enterprise. When an investor asked a sharp question about zoning, she would be the one to answer, her voice calm and assured, weaving a tapestry of half-truths and clever omissions. She would be the velvet glove on his iron fist. Together, they were a perfect predatory machine. I could picture the exact moment. Connor, sensing his audience was hooked, would deliver the closing argument. He'd speak of Project Oak, not as a business deal, but as a gift to the city, a new landmark of prosperity. He'd talk about revitalizing the neighborhood, conveniently forgetting that he was planning to destroy its most historic home. And as he spoke, Lena would watch him with a look of pure adoration, a silent, powerful endorsement that would quell any lingering doubts in the minds of the investors. I could almost hear the clink of glasses as they sealed the deal. I saw a key investor, a man named Thompson, who was known for his ruthless but profitable ventures, clasp Connor on the shoulder. I saw the triumphant, predatory smile on Connor's face, the same smile he wore just before he closed in on a kill. I saw Lena, her face glowing with pride, squeezing his arm. In that moment, in that glittering ballroom, they were on top of the world. They were invincible. They believed they had just secured the final piece of funding for their $10 million dream. They were celebrating the successful sale of a property that was in reality no longer for sale in any meaningful way. Back in my quiet office, the only sound was the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jamal was sitting in the armchair, his eyes closed, though I knew he was not asleep. He was waiting just as I was. We were two old soldiers, silent in our command post, listening to the enemy celebrate a victory on a battlefield that we had already secretly rigged with explosives. The party would end soon. The night would pass, and tomorrow at dawn, the real architect would begin his demolition. That evening, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, a plain white van with no markings pulled into my driveway and parked behind Jamal's Lincoln. Its arrival was so quiet, so unassuming, that had I not been watching for it, I would have missed it completely. Jamal and I stood in the darkened living room, looking out the window like two old generals watching for reinforcements. The van's side door slid open and 3 people emerged. They were not a rough construction crew. They were quiet academic types dressed in practical work clothes. The woman in the lead, who I presumed was the team supervisor, held a heavy-duty case and a rolled-up set of plans. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their footsteps barely making a sound on the flagstone path. I opened the door before they had a chance to ring the bell. "Good evening," the woman said, her voice a respectful whisper. "I'm Sarah from the preservation office. Dr. Jacobs sent us. You must be Mr. Carter." "I am," I said. "Thank you for coming." Her eyes went past me into the foyer, and I saw a look of genuine professional admiration on her face. She was not looking at a house. She was looking at a piece of history. "It's an honor to be here, sir," she said, and I knew she meant it. Dr. Jacobs was right. The photos in the file don't do it justice. I led them around to the front of the house, to the spot on the old brick facade we had discussed. They unrolled their plans under the soft light of the porch lamp. They worked with the quiet precision of surgeons. They took measurements, checked them against their diagrams, and used a laser level to ensure perfect alignment. There was no loud talking, only quiet murmurs and professional instructions. While they worked, I thought of Connor and Lena, likely on their way home from their gala, their minds full of multi-million-dollar projections and triumphant boasts. They were speeding toward this house, completely oblivious to the fact that its very nature was being fundamentally and irrevocably altered. They thought they were returning to a battlefield where they held all the power. They had no idea that while they were sipping champagne, we were quietly arming the fortress. The team leader opened the heavy case, and inside, nestled in thick, custom-cut foam, was the plaque. It was heavy bronze, the letters raised, and sharp, the official seal of the state of Georgia gleaming under the porch light. It was larger and more substantial than I had imagined. It was not a sign, it was a statement, a declaration of sovereignty. It was a shield forged in the fires of law and history, as they prepared to drill the mounting holes into the mortar. The team leader looked at me. "Are you ready, Mr. Carter?" she asked, a final respectful confirmation. I looked at Jamal, who gave me a single solid nod. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready." The sound of the drill was muffled, a low, determined hum. It was not a sound of destruction. It was the sound of reinforcement, of a final critical piece being locked into place. They set the plaque against the wall, the bronze a stark, beautiful contrast to the deep red of the historic brick. With a few final turns of a wrench, it was done. It looked as if it had always been there, permanent, unmovable, unquestionable. The team packed up their tools as quietly as they had arrived. Sarah handed me a folder with the official work order and a copy of the installation report. "It's official, Mr. Carter," she said, shaking my hand. "The Carter house is now properly marked. Let us know if you have any more trouble from those developers." They got back in their van and drove away, disappearing into the night as silently as they had come. Jamal and I stood on the porch for a long time looking at the plaque. It was the only thing that glittered in the darkness. The house was the same. Not a single piece of furniture had been moved. But everything had changed. The trap was set. The bait was in place. Now all we had to do was wait for the sun to rise. Jamal and I stood on the porch, two old men shrouded in the darkness, bearing witness to a quiet, momentous act of rebellion. The lead installer, Sarah, gave a final firm turn with her wrench. The sound was a solid, definitive thunk. It was done. The team stepped back almost in unison, their job complete. And there it was. Against the deep historic red of the brickwork my father had taught me how to lay the plaque was a thing of profound and undeniable power. It was thick, solid bronze, about 2 feet wide and 18 inches high. The evening dew was already beginning to collect on its surface, making the metal gleam under the soft yellow light of the porch lamp. It was not ostentatious, but its presence was absolute. It changed the entire character of the house. What was once simply a beautiful, well-maintained home was now something else entirely. It was an institution. It had been given a name, a title, a legal armor that was now visible to the entire world. The raised letters were sharp and clear, cast in a classic authoritative font. "The Carter House," the first line read. It was the first time I had ever seen our family name so formally associated with the structure, and a quiet, fierce pride swelled in my chest. Below that, in slightly smaller letters, it said, "Designated a State Historic Landmark by the Georgia Historic Preservation Division." And beneath that, the year of its designation, a silent testament to the 15-year-old secret I had kept. The final line was the most powerful, protected by state law. 4 simple words. 4 words that transformed my home from a target into a fortress. 4 words that were a declaration of war. 4 words that would bring Connor Sterling's multi-million-dollar fantasy crashing down around him. I reached out and touched it. The metal was cool and unyielding. It was real. This was no longer just a legal concept buried in a file in a government office. It was a physical fact bolted into the very bones of the house. It was a shield, and it was a weapon. The installation team packed up their tools with the same quiet efficiency with which they had worked. There was a sense of reverence in their movements, as if they understood they were not just completing a work order, but participating in an act of historical preservation. Sarah, the team leader, approached me with a folder. "It's official, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice full of a quiet satisfaction. "The Carter house is now properly marked. Let us know if you have any more trouble from those developers." The way she said developers was laced with a professional disdain that told me she had seen men like Connor 100 times before. She understood perfectly. I shook her hand. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the profound shift she and her team had just brought about. "You have no idea what this means." She smiled a knowing, compassionate smile. "I think I do, sir," she replied. They got into their plain white van and drove away, disappearing into the night as silently as they had come. Jamal and I stood on the porch for a long time looking at the plaque. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. He more than anyone understood the legal and symbolic power of what had just happened. This bronze plate was a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. It was the end of my life as a victim, as an obstacle to be managed. It was the beginning of my life as a combatant. The house no longer felt vulnerable, it felt armed, it felt like it was wearing a breastplate. Every brick seemed harder, every window more watchful. The quiet act of installing this marker had imbued the entire structure with a new and formidable power. The trap was now set. The physical evidence of my checkmate was bolted to the front of the house for all the world to see. I thought of Connor and Lena drunk on their success, returning to a home they no longer recognized, a home that now actively, legally, and physically rejected their greedy ambitions. The sun would be up in a few hours, and for the first time in a long, long time, I was looking forward to the morning. I slept soundly for the first time in a long time. It was a sleep born not of peace, but of purpose. I awoke just before dawn, feeling rested and clear-headed. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs to make coffee. My movements quiet and deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the silence had felt so suffocating just 2 nights before. Now it felt different. It was the calm, focused silence of a command center before an operation, the silence before the storm. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 7:00 a.m., the sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the lawn, and a new sound broke the morning quiet. It was the low, powerful hum of a commercial-grade generator, followed by the unmistakable, high-pitched whine of a professional drill biting into mortar. It was a clean, industrial sound, the sound of work, the sound of change. Upstairs in the master suite, I knew that sound would be an unwelcome intrusion. Connor would be waking up slowly, his head thick with expensive champagne from the gala. He would be lying in the custom-made king-sized bed, basking in the warm glow of his perceived victory. He would be replaying the conversations, the handshakes, the fawning admiration of the investors. He would be calculating his future profits, mentally spending the money he had already fraudulently secured. His world in that moment would be perfect, a testament to his own brilliance and cunning. And then that sound would pierce his self-satisfied haze, a low, insistent whine. At first he would ignore it, pulling a pillow over his head. But the sound would be relentless, vibrating through the very structure of the house. It was not a polite sound. It was the sound of something happening without his permission. Annoyance would curdle the pleasant taste of last night's success. He would sit up, the silk sheets pooling around his waist. He would listen, trying to identify the noise. A gardener with a leaf blower. No, it was too sharp, too mechanical for that. Construction next door. Maybe. But it sounded closer. Much closer. He would swing his legs out of bed, a surge of irritation sweeping through him. This was his domain. Unscheduled work was an insult to his authority. He would pull on a pair of sweatpants, his bare feet padding silently on the expensive rug. He would expect Lena to stir, but she would be deeply asleep, exhausted from her performance the night before. This was his problem to solve, his authority to assert. He would storm out of the bedroom, his face a mask of annoyance. He would follow the sound, which was growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front of the house, from the grand foyer. As he descended the main staircase, the sound would become almost deafening, a high-pitched scream of metal against brick and mortar. He would be furious now, ready to tear into whichever incompetent contractor had dared to start work on his property without his express authorization. He would reach the bottom of the stairs, turn towards the front door, ready to fling it open and unleash his wrath. But then he would stop. Because through the beveled glass panels of the front door, he would see them. 2 men in official-looking work vests with surveying equipment set up on tripods on his perfectly manicured lawn. And a large official-looking sign had been hammered into the grass, its bold letters declaring something he couldn't quite read from this distance. The anger would morph into confusion. Who were these people? What were they doing on his property? This wasn't a contractor. This was something else entirely. And for the first time, a tiny, cold sliver of doubt would pierce his champagne-fueled confidence. Something was wrong. From the kitchen where Jamal and I sat in perfect stillness over our cups of black coffee, I had a clear view of the foyer. I watched as Connor, drawn by the sound of the drill, descended the stairs. His face was a thundercloud of arrogant fury. He was a king whose sleep had been disturbed, and he was ready to have the offender executed. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his bare feet making angry slapping sounds on the marble tiles. He saw the figures on the lawn through the glass of the door and stopped dead. The anger on his face was replaced by a look of profound, irritated confusion. I saw him mouth the words, "What the hell?" He stormed to the front door, his entire body radiating an aura of violated entitlement. He yanked the heavy oak door open with a force that made it shudder in its frame, ready to unleash a torrent of threats and insults. And then he froze. The full tableau was laid out before him in the crisp morning light. The two men from the state calmly packing their surveying equipment. The official sign hammered into his perfect lawn. And there on the wall of the house he believed he owned was the thing that did not belong, the thing that should not exist. The bronze plaque. It was gleaming solid and utterly alien. For a long moment he just stared at it. His brain, thick with sleep and champagne, tried to process the impossible data. I could see the sequence of his thoughts playing out on his face as clearly as if they were projected on a screen. First confusion, then a flash of dismissive anger. Who had the audacity to put this thing on his house? He took a step out onto the porch, his eyes squinting as he read the words. I could see his lips move silently. The Carter House. A flicker of annoyance. The old man was getting sentimental, putting his name on things. A minor irritation to be dealt with later. Then he read the next line. Designated a state historic landmark. The words would have meant little to him, some bureaucratic nonsense, a plaque from a historical society perhaps. More of the old man's foolish pride. He was still in control. And then his eyes fell on the last four words. Protected by state law. Law. That was a word he understood, but it was a word he was used to wielding, not being struck by. I saw the exact moment the meaning penetrated his arrogance. The blood drained from his face. The confident, aggressive posture seemed to crumble from within. He took an involuntary step back as if the plaque had physically pushed him. He looked from the plaque to the surveyors, then back to the plaque. The pieces of an impossible puzzle were clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture of his own ruin. His $10 million project, his investors, his fraudulent loans secured against a fantasy. All of it. Built on a foundation of lies that had just been exposed by four words cast in bronze. He looked at the plaque again, his eyes wide with a dawning animalistic horror. He was not looking at a house anymore. He was looking at the tombstone of his ambition. He was looking at a legal fortress he could never breach, a fortress that had been standing silently waiting for him for 15 years. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He raised a trembling hand to his head, as if to ward off a physical blow. The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds, and then it broke. It was not a yell of anger. It was a scream, a raw, guttural, primal sound torn from the very depths of his soul. It was the sound of an empire collapsing into dust, the sound of a predator caught in a trap it never saw, the sound of a man who had just looked into the abyss and seen his own reflection. The scream echoed across the manicured lawn, scattering a flock of birds from the ancient oak tree. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. The payoff had arrived, and it was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. Connor's scream tore through the morning quiet, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. It was not a sound of controlled anger, but of a mortal wound. It was the sound a king makes when he realizes his entire kingdom is a pile of ash. The scream finally subsided, replaced by a series of choked, guttural gasps. He stood on the porch, his body trembling, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. He looked from the plaque to the calm, professional faces of the state workers who were now packing their last pieces of equipment, deliberately ignoring him. He was nothing to them, just a noisy local. This realization, this utter dismissal of his importance, seemed to enrage him even more than the plaque itself. The fury returned, flooding his face with a dark crimson tide. This was not the work of a government agency. This was a personal attack. This was the old man. He spun around, his eyes wild, and stormed back into the house. He didn't walk. He charged a wounded bull looking for the matador. "Eli!" he roared, his voice echoing off the marble floors of the foyer. The sound was monstrous, full of a murderous rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Where are you, you senile old fool?" I did not move from my seat at the kitchen table. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. Jamal sat opposite me, as still and solid as a stone monument. We were the calm eye of the hurricane that had just torn through the front door. Connor burst into the kitchen. He was a terrifying sight. His expensive athletic wear was disheveled, his hair was matted with sweat, and a vein pulsed violently on his temple. His face was a mask of pure, unrestrained hatred. He was no longer the slick, charming developer. The civilized veneer had been completely stripped away, revealing the savage brute beneath. He slammed both of his hands down on the kitchen table. The coffee cups rattled in their saucers, but neither Jamal nor I flinched. "What did you do?" he hissed, leaning across the table, his face just inches from mine. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke. "What the hell did you do?" I looked at him, my expression calm, perhaps even a little weary. I did not raise my voice. "I'm not sure what you mean, Connor," I said simply. My calmness was a lit match tossed on a gallon of gasoline. He exploded. "Don't you play dumb with me!" He bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain. "The sign, the plaque. What is that garbage you bolted to the front of my house?" "It's not your house, Connor," I replied. My voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel he had never heard before. That simple statement of fact seemed to drive him over the edge. He straightened up, grabbing the back of a kitchen chair and hurling it across the room. It smashed against the far wall, the wood splintering with a loud crack. It was a pathetic display of impotent rage, a child's tantrum. "This is my house," he screamed, his chest heaving. "I have investors, I have loans, I have a $10 million project tied to this property. You think you can ruin me with some stupid sentimental piece of junk from a historical society? I'll have that thing ripped off the wall and melted down by noon. I'll sue you for everything you have. I'll have you declared incompetent, you old fool. I'll put you in a home where you can drool into your soup and babble about the old days. You are finished. Do you hear me? Finished." He stood there panting, his tirade exhausted. He had laid all his cards on the table face up. All his threats, all his rage, all his pathetic, desperate plans. He looked at me, a wild, triumphant gleam in his eyes, expecting me to crumble, to beg, to finally break. I just took another sip of my coffee. I placed the cup gently back in its saucer and looked over at my old friend. "Jamal," I said, my voice as calm as a summer morning, "I believe that constitutes a direct, actionable verbal threat. Wouldn't you agree?" Jamal smiled a slow, dangerous smile. "Oh, absolutely, Eli," he said, his voice like silk-wrapped steel. "And that's not even the most interesting legal problem he has right now." Connor's threats hung in the air, pathetic and hollow. He stood panting, his face flushed, expecting his outburst to have shattered my resolve. He was waiting for me to beg to plead. He was waiting for the fear he felt he was owed. Instead, he was met with the quiet, unshakable calm of two old men who had seen far worse monsters than him. At my words, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. He looked from me to Jamal as if seeing him for the first time not as an irrelevant old man, but as a potential threat. "Legal problem," he scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "You think this old ambulance chaser is going to scare me? I have a team of lawyers who could buy and sell him before breakfast." Jamal didn't rise to the bait. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase, which he had placed on the floor beside his chair. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that was in itself an act of supreme confidence. He placed two folders on the kitchen table. One was old and worn, the other was crisp and new. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Sterling," Jamal said, his voice as smooth and cool as the marble floor. "I am old, which means I have learned that the most effective way to win a fight is to avoid having one in the first place. But if a fight is unavoidable," he paused, tapping the folders with a long, elegant finger, "the next best thing is to ensure it's over before the other side even knows it has begun." From the doorway, a new voice spoke sharp and clear. "Am I interrupting?" We all turned. A young woman stood there dressed in an impeccably tailored dark gray suit. She was sharp, bright, and radiated an aura of ferocious intelligence. It was the young lawyer Jamal had mentored, the one he had called after our meeting. She held a tablet in her hands. "Ah, Ms. Chentanyon," Jamal said, a warm smile briefly touching his lips. "Perfect timing. Connor, Lena, this is Amelia Chen. She's a specialist in historic preservation law and real estate fraud. I thought it would be helpful for her to join us." The mention of real estate fraud was a perfectly aimed dart. I saw Connor flinch. Lena, who had been standing frozen by the doorway, her face a pale mask of horror, looked at the young lawyer with a flicker of professional recognition and then dawning dread. The room was no longer a kitchen. It had become a deposition room. Ms. Chen nodded curtly at Connor and Lena, her eyes missing nothing. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice crisp and businesslike, "my colleague, Mr. Coleman, has asked me to help clarify the legal status of this property for you to prevent you from making any further professional missteps." Jamal opened the first folder and slid a document across the table. It was the Historic Landmark Designation Certificate. "Let's start with this," Jamal said calmly. This document, filed and ratified 13 years ago, designates this entire property as a state historic landmark. This is not a sentimental honor, Mr. Sterling. It is a legally binding status with a number of rather strict protections under Georgia state law. Ms. Chen picked up the narrative without missing a beat, her eyes fixed on Connor. Specifically, under State Preservation Statute 4, subsection C, demolition of this structure is prohibited. Under subsection E, any alteration to the exterior facade is also prohibited without a unanimous vote of the Preservation Board. And under Section 7, subdivision of the property plot or any new construction is for all intents and purposes impossible. Each point was a hammer blow, dismantling his entire fantasy piece by piece. Connor just stared at them, his mouth slightly agape. The rage was draining away, replaced by a horrifying, gut-wrenching understanding. He was a predator who had just discovered that the delicious meal he was about to eat was in fact made of poison and steel. "You're bluffing," he stammered, but the words had no conviction. They were the last gasp of a dying king. Jamal just smiled, that slow, dangerous smile. "Oh, we haven't even gotten to the interesting part yet, son," he said, his hand hovering over the second, newer folder. "That was just the shield. This," he tapped the folder, "is the sword." Connor's bravado was a flimsy shield, and it was beginning to shatter. He looked at the second folder, then at me, then at Jamal, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. The swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered fear. He was a man who built his world on bluffs and intimidation, and he had just realized he was sitting at a table with players who held all the cards. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, his voice losing its thunder. "A scare tactic. You have nothing." Jamal didn't deign to reply. He simply opened the second folder. It didn't contain embossed certificates or formal legal documents. It contained a thick stack of ordinary, flimsy printer paper. He slid the stack across the table, not to Connor but to me. It was a deliberate, symbolic gesture. This was my evidence to present, my story to tell. I stood up from my chair. The movement was slow, my old bones protesting, but it felt powerful. I picked up the stack of papers. It was heavy in my hands, the physical weight of their betrayal. I walked around the table and placed the stack directly in the center between Connor and Lena. The solid thud of the paper hitting the polished wood was the only sound in the room. It was a sound of finality. "You're right, Connor," I said, my voice quiet, every word carefully chosen. "These are not legal documents. These are just words. Your words." I tapped the top page. "This, for example, is the email chain between you and your lawyers at Sterling Oak Advisory. The one where you meticulously document my every perceived failing, where you note that I forgot a neighbor's name or misplaced my keys, where you build your case lie by lie to have me declared incompetent." His face went ashen. The digital ghost of his conspiracy had just materialized in the stark light of the kitchen. "And this," I continued, flipping through a few pages to reveal the glossy renderings, "is Project Oak, your $10 million dream. The investor prospectus with the lovely picture of my home on the cover. The fraudulent financial projections you use to secure loans against a property you will never own." I could feel Lena begin to tremble beside me. She hadn't said a word. She was frozen, a statue of pure horror. My gaze shifted to her, and for the first time the steel in my voice softened, replaced by a grief so profound it was almost a physical presence. I flipped to the very last page of the stack and turned it around so she could see it clearly. It was her email. Her name, her professional email address was at the top. Her words, so calm, so rational, so utterly devastating, were there in black and white. "But this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "this is the one that I don't think I will ever truly understand." I looked directly into my daughter's eyes. I was not angry. I was heartbroken, and that was so much worse. I began to quote her own words back to her. "My only concern is the emotional impact on my father. We need to be delicate. This has to be framed as an act of love, to be handled in a way that causes the least amount of pain, and preserves his dignity as much as possible." A sound escaped Lena's lips, a choked, strangled sob. It was the sound of a soul breaking. She stared at her own words printed on the cheap paper, and they were a mirror reflecting a monster she never believed she could be. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with tears. She was searching for the anger, for the rage she deserved, for the shouting match that would have allowed her to defend herself. But she found none. All she found was the vast, quiet, empty expanse of my disappointment. All she saw was a father looking at a stranger. The silence in the room was absolute. Connor was beaten. His schemes exposed his financial world on the verge of collapse. But that was a battle of numbers and laws. This was a battle for a soul, and it was already over. The stack of papers sat on the table between us, an ugly, undeniable monument to their greed and their betrayal. They were just words, but they were the most powerful weapon in the room. They were the truth, and the truth had just burned their world to the ground. The moment my words, her own words, left my lips, something inside Lena finally broke. It was a complete and utter collapse. The poised, brilliant lawyer, the confident, sophisticated wife of a wealthy developer, all of it dissolved in an instant. All that was left was a heartbroken daughter finally and irrevocably confronted with the ugliness of her own choices. A terrible, ragged sob was torn from her chest, and she stumbled forward, her hands outstretched. Not to Connor, but to me. She fell to her knees on the cold marble floor, her body trembling. "Daddy." She choked out the word, a relic from a childhood she had just betrayed. "Daddy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears streamed down her face, washing away the carefully constructed mask she had worn for years. I never wanted... I didn't mean for... She couldn't finish the sentence. The words caught in her throat, choked by the enormity of what she had done. Connor, he was so convincing. She pleaded, her voice a desperate, broken whisper. He talked about the future, about securing our lives, about giving you a retirement you deserved without any worries. He made it sound so logical, so responsible. She was a lawyer making her closing argument to the one jury she could not afford to lose. But her words were not justifications. They were a confession, a desperate, rambling attempt to explain a series of small moral compromises that had led to this catastrophic, soul-destroying betrayal. "I got caught up in it," she cried, looking up at me, her face a ruin of tears and shame. "I got caught up in the money and the lifestyle and the ambition. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself we were protecting you, protecting the estate. I lied to myself, Daddy. Every day I lied to myself. I knew it was wrong. In my heart I knew. But I didn't listen. I did not speak. I did not move. I simply stood there looking down at her, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I felt no satisfaction in her breakdown, no triumph, only a vast, empty wasteland of sorrow. I had wanted my daughter back, but I knew with a terrible certainty that the person kneeling before me was a stranger I could never fully trust again. My silence was her true punishment. It was a mirror reflecting the full horror of her actions without the comforting distraction of my anger. She had been prepared for a fight. She had not been prepared for this quiet, unbreachable wall of my pain. "Please," she begged, crawling forward and grabbing the fabric of my pants, her grip as desperate as a drowning woman's. "Please say something. Yell at me, scream at me, call me a monster, anything. Please don't just stand there. Please, Daddy." Her pleas were desperate, raw. She was a wordsmith, a master of persuasion, but all her skill was useless now. She had used her words to create this wound, and now she discovered to her horror that she had no words that could heal it. I looked down at the top of her head at the daughter who had been my entire world. I saw the little girl who used to fall asleep in my arms, and I saw the cold-eyed strategist who had reviewed the legal plans to strip me of my dignity. And I could not reconcile the two. I could not find the path back to the person I had loved without reservation. The damage was too deep, the foundation was too broken. "Please," she whispered one last time, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "Talk to me." I finally moved. I gently but firmly disengaged her hand from my leg. I took a step back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the vast emotional chasm that now lay between us. I looked at her kneeling on the floor, a broken, weeping woman, and I felt nothing but the cold, quiet truth. "There is nothing to say, Lena," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth, all anger, all love. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, irreversible sentence. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of the family she had helped destroy. My footsteps were the only sound in the room as I walked away from my daughter. Each step was deliberate, measured. I did not look back. I knew what I would see, a woman I no longer recognized, kneeling in the ruins of a life she had willingly helped to shatter. To look back would be to engage with her pain, and I no longer had the capacity for it. My heart was not a well of infinite forgiveness. It was a structure, and she had demolished it. I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room. I went to the large picture window that overlooked the garden Rose's garden and stood with my back to the wreckage in the other room. Outside, the sun was fully up now, casting a bright, beautiful light on a world that was indifferent to the human tragedy unfolding within my walls. The birds were singing. A neighbor was walking their dog. The world went on oblivious. Behind me, the silence was a living thing. It was composed of different elements. There was Connor's silence, a stunned, terrified paralysis. He was a general whose army had vanished, whose maps were useless. He was staring at the utter annihilation of his future. There was Lena's silence, a choked, ragged thing punctuated by the occasional hitching sob. It was the silence of complete and total devastation, the sound of a soul that has looked into the mirror and seen a monster. And then there was the calm, professional silence of Jamal and Amelia Chen. They were not family. They were not caught in the emotional crossfire. They were the architects of this demolition, and they were now simply observing the collapse of the structure, waiting for the dust to settle before they began to sift through the rubble for legal liabilities. But my silence was the most powerful of all. It was not an absence of noise. It was a statement. It was a wall built brick by brick from every lie, every betrayal, every small compromise she had made. It was a wall she could never climb, a door she could never open. I heard a movement behind me. It was Jamal. He came and stood beside me, not speaking, just looking out at the garden. "What now?" I asked him. My voice a low murmur, my eyes still fixed on the roses. I was not asking about Lena. I was not asking about Connor. I was asking about the logistics of the war. "Now we let the dust settle," he said, his voice equally quiet. "Amelia will serve Connor with a cease and desist letter regarding his fraudulent communications with his investors. We will file a formal complaint with the state bar regarding Lena's professional misconduct. We will change your will. We will secure your assets. We will build a new fortress around you, Eli, a legal one this time." He was right. The emotional battle was over. The logistical one was just beginning. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a profound, bone-deep weariness. The quiet of the room was finally broken by a different sound. It was the sound of Connor, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper. "Lena," he said, "get up. Just get up." I heard the rustle of her dress as she struggled to her feet. I heard her choked, weeping breaths. I did not turn around. I did not want to see her face. I did not want to see the ruin I had wrought. I had done what I had to do. I had protected the house. I had protected Rose's memory. I had protected my own dignity. But the cost had been my own child. The silence stretched on thick and suffocating. Finally, I heard their footsteps, hesitant and broken, as they walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs. The sound of their retreat was the sound of my victory. It was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. I stood at the window for a long time after they were gone, long after Jamal had quietly seen himself out. I stood there until the morning sun was high in the sky, looking at the roses my wife had planted, feeling nothing at all. The battle was over. I had won. And I had lost everything. The confrontation in the kitchen was not an explosion. It was a controlled demolition. And in the quiet aftermath, the real collapse began. It didn't start with a bang, but with a series of quiet, professional, and utterly devastating phone calls and emails. While Connor and Lena were upstairs locked in the tomb of their own making, Jamal and Amelia Chen began their work. They were not interested in the emotional wreckage. They were focused on the structural, financial, and legal consequences. The first domino was a man named Arthur Thompson. He was the lead investor in Project Oak, a ruthless old-money developer who had built his empire by preying on weakness and never making a sentimental mistake. He was the shark Connor had been so proud to land the anchor of the entire fraudulent enterprise. Amelia Chen made the call. It was a masterpiece of professional courtesy and legal assassination. I imagined Thompson in his penthouse office overlooking the city, a cup of coffee in his hand, feeling pleased with the world. He would have seen the call come in from a prestigious law firm and answered it with a sense of self-importance. Amelia would have been polite, introducing herself as legal counsel for Elijah Carter, the owner of the property at 142 Oak Street. She would have calmly and with no emotion whatsoever informed him that a due diligence review on behalf of her client had revealed some potential discrepancies in the prospectus for Project Oak. She would have then, with surgical precision, informed him that the property was and had been for 13 years a state historic landmark and that its demolition was a legal impossibility. There would have been a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Thompson, a man who prided himself on his thoroughness, would have felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He would have blustered, of course. He would have accused her of lying, of a desperate legal maneuver. But Amelia would have been prepared. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," she would have said, her voice a placid sea of professionalism. "I wouldn't expect you to take my word for it. Please check the public records on the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office website. I've taken the liberty of emailing you the direct link to the designation file. I suggest you also look at the state statutes regarding real estate fraud and securing loans against non-viable assets." That would be the killing blow. The mention of fraud, the easy, verifiable proof. Thompson would have ended the call, his hands already flying across his keyboard. He would have found the public record in under a minute. He would have seen the gold seal, the date, the statutes. He would have seen the incontrovertible, humiliating truth. He, Arthur Thompson, had been made a fool of. He had been sold a ghost story by an amateur, arrogant fraud. His rage would have been volcanic, but it would not have been directed at me. It would have been directed at Connor. The first domino had fallen, and it fell hard. Within an hour, Arthur Thompson had not only pulled his entire multi-million-dollar investment, but he had also made a series of calls to his own lawyers instructing them to begin proceedings to sue Connor for every penny he had plus damages. But he didn't stop there. To protect his own reputation, he made another series of calls. To the other smaller investors in the project, he told them in no uncertain terms that Project Oak was a sham, that the property was undevelopable, and that Connor Sterling was a fraud. Panic is a virus, and in the world of high-stakes investment, it spreads faster than fire. The other investors, terrified of being left holding the bag, scrambled to pull their own money out. Connor's phone, which had been silent upstairs, would have begun to light up. A cascade of furious text messages, a flood of emails with subject lines like "Urgent, Project Oak," and "Immediate withdrawal of funds." The news spread through the city's financial circles with the speed of gossip. The story was just too good. Connor Sterling, the brash, arrogant wunderkind, had tried to tear down a historic landmark and had been caught. He was not just a failure, he was a joke. His entire empire, which I now understood was a house of cards built on charisma and dangerously over-leveraged loans, began to shudder. The dominoes were falling one after another, a cascade of financial ruin triggered by a single quiet phone call. Upstairs, Connor would be looking at his phone, his face turning from ashen to ghost white as he watched his entire world, his reputation, his future evaporate in real time. The quiet hum of the drill that had woken him up that morning had been a prelude. This was the real sound of his demolition. The quiet, relentless, and unstoppable cascade of his own collapse. The storm of frantic text messages and emails eventually subsided. It was replaced by a different kind of quiet, a heavy, waiting silence, the silence of an army that has been routed, waiting for the victors to dictate the terms of surrender. I knew that Connor and Lena were upstairs in their room, not speaking, just existing in the shared space of their ruin. They were prisoners of their own home, their own ambition. The first knock on the door came just after midday. It was a sharp, official rap that was utterly different from the knock of a friend or a delivery person. It was the sound of consequence arriving in person. Connor, who must have been watching the driveway like a hawk, came down the stairs. He moved like a man in a trance, his face pale and drawn. He opened the door to a tired-looking man in a cheap suit holding a clipboard and a thick envelope. "Connor Sterling," the man asked, his voice flat and bored. Connor nodded mutely. The man handed him the envelope. "You've been served," he said, and walked away without another word. Connor looked at the papers in his hand as if they were a venomous snake. The name on the return address was that of Arthur Thompson's law firm, one of the most powerful and notoriously aggressive in the city. This was not a warning shot. This was a declaration of total war. He stumbled back into the foyer, the papers trembling in his hand. He sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, the very staircase he had dreamed of his wealthy friends ascending for lavish parties, and began to read. That was only the beginning. It was not a single attack. It was a siege. Before the end of the day, 2 more process servers arrived. One was from the bank that had issued the fraudulent bridge loans, suing not only for immediate repayment but for punitive damages related to financial fraud. The other was from a smaller group of investors who had pooled their money, now suing him for misrepresentation and breach of contract. Each new envelope was another nail in the coffin of his career. It was a relentless, methodical legal barrage. But it was Lena's reaction that was the most telling. As a lawyer, she understood the language of these documents intimately. When she came downstairs and saw the stack of legal summonses on the foyer table, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She did something far worse. A look of cold professional dread washed over her face. She picked up the summons from Thompson's firm and read it, her eyes scanning the legal terminology with a terrifying speed and comprehension. She understood the weight of every clause, the threat behind every legal precedent cited. This was not a negotiation. This was an execution. I saw the lawyer in her die replaced by the terrified defendant. She knew with absolute certainty that they were not just going to lose. They were going to be annihilated. Their assets would be frozen. Their reputations would be destroyed. Connor would likely face disbarment from the Developers Guild, and she herself was now implicated in a conspiracy that could end her own legal career. I did not orchestrate this. I did not have to. This was the natural, inevitable result of Connor's own actions. I had simply held up a mirror, and the world had finally seen him for what he was, a con man. The men he had tried to swindle were now turning on him with a savagery that made my own quiet revenge seem tame. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water. The lawsuits were the teeth. I had not created the storm. I had simply, after years of quiet observation, pointed out a fatal flaw in his design. The subsequent collapse was not my work. It was the work of gravity, of truth, of the inevitable consequences he himself had set in motion long ago. He had built a house of cards on my foundation, and I had just introduced a slight breeze. While the legal and financial storm raged outside the walls of my house, a different kind of storm, more intimate and perhaps more brutal, was tearing through the master suite upstairs. The silence between Connor and Lena had been a heavy, suffocating thing. But silence, like a vacuum, cannot last. It must be filled. And it was filled with the bitter poison of blame. It was Connor who spoke first. He had been staring at his phone, watching his empire crumble in a cascade of emails and news alerts. The paralysis of shock was wearing off, replaced by the familiar comforting heat of rage. But his rage had nowhere to go. It couldn't touch me. It couldn't touch Jamal. So it turned, as it always did, on the closest, most convenient target. "This is your fault," he hissed, the words dropping like stones into the quiet room. Lena, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, a crumpled, weeping figure, looked up. Her face was swollen, her eyes red-rimmed. "My fault," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Yes, your fault," he snarled, standing up and beginning to pace like a caged wolf. "You were supposed to handle him. He's your father. You were the one who was supposed to keep him in line, massage his ego, make sure he didn't do anything stupid, but you couldn't do it. You were weak. You let your pathetic sentimentality get in the way." His words were a series of cruel, jabbing blows. He was not just angry. He was rewriting history, casting himself as the victim of her incompetence. For the first time all morning, a flicker of something other than shame appeared in Lena's eyes. It was a spark of cold, hard clarity. "Handle him," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "He's my father, Connor. He is not a difficult employee to be handled. He is a human being whose home you tried to steal, whose dignity you tried to strip away." Connor laughed, a harsh, ugly sound devoid of all humor. "Dignity? We're talking about a $10 million development project that would have set us up for life, and you're talking about the dignity of a senile old man. You're a lawyer, for God's sake. Where was your killer instinct? Where was the brilliant woman I married?" "She was busy being a daughter," Lena said, and as she spoke, she stood up. The movement was slow, but she was no longer a crumpled victim. She was a woman finally seeing the truth with unclouded eyes. "And I see now that the brilliant woman you married was just another asset to you, wasn't she? Another tool to get what you wanted. You didn't marry me, Connor. You married this house. You married my name and my connection to it." The accusation hit him harder than any lawsuit. He stopped pacing and stared at her. "You loved that I was Elijah Carter's daughter." She continued, her voice growing stronger, colder with every word. "You loved that it gave you in a way to get your hands on this property. You preyed on my love for you and my complicated love for him. You used me. You used my desire to please you, to build a life with you as a weapon against my own father. I gave you a life you could have only dreamed of." He shot back, his voice rising to a desperate yell. The cars, the clothes, the country club. You loved it all. Don't you dare pretend you were some innocent victim. You're right, she said, and her agreement seemed to stun him into silence. I did love it, and I hated myself for it. I let it blind me. I let it make me weak. But I'm not blind anymore, Connor. She took a step towards him, and for the first time he took a step back. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I see you now, she said, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. I see all of you. A cheap, desperate con man in an expensive suit. A bully who mistook my father's kindness for weakness. A fraud who lied to his investors, and a husband who lied to his wife every single day of our marriage. She walked to her closet and pulled out a suitcase. The sound of the zippers opening was unnaturally loud in the silent room. My father was right, she said, her back to him as she began to pull dresses from their hangers. He built a fortress, and you just flew your airplane right into the side of it. But don't worry, I won't be in the wreckage with you. As of this moment, my legal counsel is my father's. I suggest you find your own. With that, she turned and looked at him one last time, her eyes completely empty of love, of hate, of anything at all. They were the eyes of a lawyer looking at an opposing counsel she was about to destroy. Our marriage is over, she said, and then she went back to packing. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The financial collapse, the end of my marriage, those were violent, explosive events. But the final blow was a quiet one, delivered not in anger, but in a history lesson that completely and utterly dismantled my soul. I came down the stairs with my suitcase in my hand. My father was waiting for me at the bottom, standing in the foyer. He was not looking at me with anger or even with the cold disappointment from before. He just looked old and tired. Before you go, he said, his voice a low, even murmur, I need to tell you a story. Not about me. About this land. He gestured to the floor beneath our feet. Do you know who owned this land before I did? I don't know, I whispered. The city, I guess. He shook his head slowly. No. My grandfather, Samuel Carter, was a sharecropper on this very piece of earth. He was born just a few years after the end of the Civil War. He spent his entire life working this soil, raising crops that were not his, living in a shack that was not his hands stained with the dust of another man's land. He spoke as if he were a historian, his voice devoid of emotion, which made the story all the more powerful. But Samuel had a dream, he continued, a quiet, stubborn, impossible dream. He wanted to own the land he worked, not just any land, this land. So every single day for 50 years after he had given the landowner his share, he would save a penny, or a nickel if it was a good year. He kept it in a tin box buried under a loose floorboard in his shack. It was a secret he kept from the entire world. My suitcase suddenly felt very heavy. When he was nearly 70 years old, bent and broken from a lifetime of labor, the landowner's son, a man who had inherited the property and saw it as nothing but a burden, decided to sell it off. My grandfather went to him, took off his hat, and emptied the contents of that tin box onto his desk. 50 years of pennies and dimes and backbreaking work. It was just enough. My father walked over to the wall and placed a hand on it as if he could feel the history pulsing within. The landowner laughed at him, but he took the money. My grandfather, who could not read or write, signed the deed with an X. He owned it. He finally owned it. He only got to live on his own land as a free man for 2 years before he died. He passed it to my father, who passed it to me. And on his deathbed, my father made me promise that I would build something on Samuel's land that was worthy of his sacrifice. Something permanent. Something that would announce to the world that the Carters were no longer sharecroppers, that we were architects, that we were here to stay. He finally turned and looked at me, and his eyes were not empty anymore. They were filled with the weight of all that history, all that pain, and all that pride. And I saw for the first time the true magnitude of my crime. You see, Lena, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut me deeper than any scream. You weren't trying to sell a house for $10 million. You were trying to sell 50 years of your great-grandfather's sweat and humiliation for a rooftop pool. You were trying to put a price on the one thing our family ever truly owned. The suitcase slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor. The sound was obscene in the sacred silence. I finally understood. It was not about the money. It was not about the betrayal of a father by his daughter. It was so much bigger than that. It was a betrayal of history. A betrayal of the ancestors whose suffering had been the down payment for my privileged life. I had tried to sell their soul. I opened my mouth to say I was sorry, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? There were no words in the English language that could contain the apology I owed. I simply stood there, crushed under the weight of a history I had never bothered to learn, condemned by a legacy I had so carelessly, so callously tried to auction off to the highest bidder. I bent down, picked up my suitcase, and walked out the front door, closing it softly behind me. I had not just lost my husband, my father, and my home. I had lost my place in that story. I was an exile from my own past, and I knew I would wander in that wilderness for the rest of my life. 6 months. It is a surprisingly short amount of time for a world to end and for a new one to begin. The house is quiet now, but it is a different kind of quiet. It is not the heavy, suffocating silence of a family holding its breath. It is a peaceful, breathing silence. The kind of silence that allows you to hear the birds in the ancient oak tree, the gentle bubbling of the fountain in the garden, and the soft scratch of my pencil on a fresh sheet of drafting paper. I spend most of my days in my office now, but it is no longer a war room. It is a sanctuary again, a place of creation. The rage and the grief have receded like a great flood, leaving behind a landscape that is scoured clean and ready for new growth. I hear of Connor sometimes. His name appears in the business section of the newspaper, always accompanied by words like bankruptcy, litigation, and fraud. His spectacular collapse has become a cautionary tale among the city's elite. Arthur Thompson and the other investors were relentless. They picked his financial empire apart bone by bone until there was nothing left but a mountain of debt and a reputation so toxic he will likely never work in this city again. I take no pleasure in his ruin. It is simply the logical mathematical result of the flawed equation he created. He was a man who built his life on a foundation of lies, and a lie can only bear so much weight before it gives way. He is no longer a part of my story. He is a ghost, a footnote in a chapter that is now closed. Lena is a different matter. She did not disappear. She is rebuilding. She left Connor the day of the confrontation and never looked back. She lives in a small apartment downtown, a place so modest it would fit inside the master suite of her old life. She left her prestigious law firm unable to face the whispers and the professional fallout from the formal complaint Jamal filed on my behalf. She works for a small legal aid clinic, now helping people who have been cheated by landlords or employers. People like the ones Connor used to be. It is, I suppose, a form of penance, a way to use her considerable skills to build something instead of destroying it. We speak sometimes. The calls are infrequent and always difficult. They are filled with long, awkward silences, the ghosts of things we can never say, the vast empty space of her betrayal lying between us. She does not ask for forgiveness. I think she understands that it is not something I am capable of giving right now. Instead, she tells me about her work. She tells me about a family she helped keep from being evicted, or a woman she helped get back wages that were stolen from her. She is not telling me these things to impress me. She is, I think, simply showing me her work. She is a builder who has learned the importance of a solid foundation, and she is starting over one small, honest brick at a time. I listen. I do not offer praise. I do not offer absolution. I simply listen. It is all I can do. It is a fragile, tentative beginning. I do not know if the bridge between us can ever be fully rebuilt. The damage to the foundation was too severe. But perhaps over time we can build something new, something smaller, more honest, something that can bear the weight of the truth. I do not know. For now, I just listen. And in the long silences after we hang up, I return to my drafting table, to the clean white page, and I begin to sketch out the plans for a different kind of future. The first time she called a month after she left, the ringing of the phone felt like an alarm. I let it ring 3 times, my hand hovering over the receiver. My first instinct was to ignore it, to let the silence hold. But curiosity, a cold architectural curiosity, won out. I wanted to see the shape of this new thing, this new relationship. I picked it up. "Hello," I said. "Dad." Her voice was small, tentative, a stranger's voice in a daughter's throat. "It's me, Lena." "I know," I said. The silence that followed was a vast empty space filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken apologies. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, a ragged, uncertain sound. She was waiting for me to say something, to give her an opening, an absolution. I offered none. Finally, she broke the silence. I I just wanted to see how you were doing, she said. I am fine, Lena, I replied. My voice was not cold, not angry. It was simply factual, the voice of an architect describing the state of a building. More silence, then a rushed, nervous stream of words. Okay, that's good. I just wanted to call. I should go. I'll call again sometime. And she hung up. The calls became a weekly ritual. Every Sunday afternoon the phone would ring and we would engage in the same stilted, painful dance. The conversations were never about us. They were never about the past. The past was a blasted, radioactive landscape that neither of us dared to enter. She never mentioned Connor's name. She never asked for forgiveness. I think she understood on some deep, fundamental level that the word sorry was a currency she no longer had. Instead, she started talking about her work. At first, it was just small things. The frustrating bureaucracy of the legal aid system, a difficult client, mundane details. I listened. I said very little. I was not her father offering comfort. I was a structural engineer listening to a report on a building that had failed, noting the attempts to shore up the foundation. Then one day the stories changed. She told me about a case she had won. An elderly woman, a tenant in a rundown apartment building, was being evicted by a new landlord who wanted to flip the property. The landlord had used a series of illegal tactics, intimidation, shutting off her heat in the middle of winter. As Lena spoke, her voice changed. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused anger. The anger of a lawyer who has seen an injustice and is using her skills to make it right. She described how she had dug through the city's housing codes, how she had found a forgotten bylaw that protected tenants in that specific zone. She told me how she had confronted the landlord's high-priced lawyer in court and systematically dismantled his case. She didn't sound proud. She sounded purposeful. She told me the landlord had to not only cancel the eviction but pay the old woman damages. I listened to the entire story without saying a word. The irony was as thick as iron. She had fought for a stranger, for an old person being pushed out of their home by a greedy developer. She had become the lawyer she should have been for me. When she finished, there was a long pause. Anyway, she said, her voice small again, I just thought you'd want to know. I did not tell her I was proud of her. I did not tell her that this was a good first step. I simply said, that was the right thing to do, Lena. I heard her take a sharp breath, a sound that was half sob, half relief. It was the closest thing to praise I had given her in 6 months. It was a single small stone laid on the ruins of a collapsed bridge. It was not a foundation, but it was a start. My days found a new rhythm, one dictated not by the ringing of a telephone or the arrival of a process server, but by the slow, patient cycles of the sun and the seasons. I started spending my afternoons in the garden, Rose's garden. During the heat of the battle, I had neglected it. Weeds had begun to creep into the flower beds, and the climbing roses on the trellis had grown wild and tangled. At first, the work felt like a chore, another problem to be solved. But as my hands went into the cool, dark earth, something began to shift. I started with the weeds. I would kneel on the soft ground, the scent of damp soil filling the air, and I would pull them out one by one. The act was simple, methodical, deeply satisfying. Each weed was a small piece of chaos and intrusion, and with a firm, steady pull, I could remove it, leaving behind only the clean, dark soil, ready for something beautiful to grow. It was not a battle. It was an act of restoration. As I worked, I felt Rose's presence everywhere. This garden had been her sanctuary, her masterpiece. While I had been building with brick and steel, she had been building with life itself. She had a philosophy about gardening that was, I now realized, a philosophy about everything. You can't force things to grow, Eli, she used to say, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek. You can only create the right conditions. Good soil, a little water, and a lot of patience. The rest is up to them. I found her old gardening gloves worn and stiff on a shelf in the potting shed. I put them on, and my large hands fit perfectly into the spaces her smaller ones had made. It felt like holding her hand. I began to prune the roses, cutting away the dead wood, the tangled branches that were choking the new growth. Each snip of the shears was a careful, deliberate decision. It was not an act of destruction, but of cultivation. I was not destroying the past. I was making room for the future. I would talk to her sometimes, quietly under my breath. I would tell her about the state of her beloved hydrangeas, or how the Japanese maple was turning a particularly brilliant shade of crimson this year. I told her about Lena, about the difficult phone calls, about the small, fragile shoots of a new kind of relationship that were beginning to emerge. In the quiet of the garden, I could almost hear her reply, "Be patient, Eli. Just create the right conditions." So that's what I did. I pulled the weeds. I pruned the dead branches. I watered the soil. I did not try to force a reconciliation. I did not try to erase the past. I simply tended to the space between us, hoping that with enough time and care, something new and beautiful might one day choose to grow there. The days grew shorter. The air grew cooler. But the garden under my care seemed to thrive. I found a deep, quiet peace in this simple, honest work. I was not a warrior anymore. I was not a victim. I was a gardener, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was home. The peace I found in the garden was a restorative one, but I am not a gardener by trade. I am an architect. My hands, which had grown accustomed to the soft earth and the patient rhythm of pruning, began to feel an old, familiar itch, the itch to create. The need to solve a problem not with shears and a trowel, but with a T-square and a freshly sharpened pencil. I returned to my office, to my drafting table. For the first time in 6 months, it did not feel like a war room. The ghosts of Connor's fraudulent plans and Lena's devastating emails had been exorcised. The space was clean again, a blank slate. I unrolled a fresh sheet of heavy cream-colored drafting paper. The crisp rattle of the paper was a sound of pure potential. I weighted down the corners, and for a long time I just looked at it. I had no client. I had no brief. I had no budget. All I had was a house, a history, and a future that was a complete unknown. My first impulse was to design something for myself. A new workshop in the back of the garden, perhaps, or a small library extension. But the ideas felt small, selfish. They were about retreat, about closing the doors on the world. And the past few months, as painful as they had been, had not taught me to retreat. They had taught me to reinforce my foundations and fight for what mattered. What mattered now, it was not just about protecting the past anymore. The fortress had been secured. The battle was won. Now the question was, what does a fortress do in peacetime? Does it simply stand there, a monument to a past conflict, or can it become something more? I thought of my great-grandfather Samuel Carter saving his pennies in a tin box. He wasn't just buying land. He was buying a future for generations he would never meet. I thought of the salvaged materials built into the walls of this house, the ghosts of a community's history. They were not just relics. They were seeds. My pencil finally touched the paper. The first line I drew was a clean, confident stroke. I was not drawing for myself. I was not designing a private sanctuary. An idea bigger and more ambitious than any I had conceived in years began to take shape. I was not just an old man in a historic house. I was the steward of a legacy. And a legacy is not something you hoard. It is something you give away. The lines began to flow from my pencil, one connecting to the next. I sketched out a new entrance not for a private home but for a public space. I reimagined the large, formal living room, not as a place for quiet reflection, but as a gallery, a place to display the history of the materials, the story of the builders and creators who had been erased from the city's official narrative. I redesigned the upstairs bedrooms not as places to sleep, but as classrooms, as workshops for young, aspiring architects of color who, like me, had to fight for their place at the table. The lines on the paper were no longer just architectural drawings. They were a plan to transform this house from a private fortress into a public trust, to turn this symbol of my family's survival into a resource for the community's future. The work was slow, meticulous, deeply joyful. I was not just drawing lines on a page, I was building a new bridge, a bridge from my family's painful past to a future full of purpose, a bridge from my own private grief to a new public hope. The house had been saved. Now I was drawing the plans for its salvation. The initial sketches were just lines, an architect's muscle memory. But as I worked day after day, a new kind of energy flowed through me. The small, hesitant ideas of a gallery or a classroom began to connect to form a larger, more coherent vision. It was like watching a building structure emerge from the chaos of a construction site. I was no longer just redesigning a house, I was drafting a new social contract. I began to see it clearly. This house, which had been a symbol of my family's rise from sharecropping to the professional class, had a purpose far greater than just being a home for one family. Its true value was not in its market price but in its story. And a story is not meant to be kept under lock and key. It is meant to be told. The idea that took root was not just for a museum or a school, but for a living, breathing institution. I began to sketch out a name, lettering it carefully at the top of a new blueprint, the Carter House Center for Community History and Architectural Preservation. It was more than a name. It was a mission statement. The center would have two primary functions, two pillars supporting the entire structure. The first pillar would be preservation. The house itself would be the main exhibit. The salvaged materials, the ghosts of our city's erased history, would be meticulously documented and displayed. People could come and learn the story of the community that had been paved over to see the physical evidence that they were not forgotten. It would be a place of remembrance, a defiant act against the bulldozers of urban renewal. The second pillar would be creation. This was the part that truly excited me. The upstairs workshops would not just be classrooms, they would be incubators. We would offer a fellowship, a fully funded program for a small select group of young, talented architects and designers from underprivileged backgrounds. They would live and work in the house for a year. They would study its history, learn the principles of preservation, and then be challenged to design new projects for the community, affordable housing, public parks, community centers. We wouldn't just be teaching them how to build buildings. We would be teaching them how to build communities. This was the true purpose. The legacy of Samuel Carter's 50 years of sacrifice would not be a piece of property for his descendants to fight over. It would be a wellspring of opportunity for a new generation of builders. The history preserved in these walls would not be a static, dead thing. It would be the foundation upon which new histories, new futures would be built. I looked at the plans taking shape on my table. They were the most ambitious, the most meaningful work of my entire life. I had spent my career building structures for other people, for clients, for the city. Now, for the first time, I was designing a structure for my own soul, for the soul of my community. The battle with Connor had forced me to build a fortress to protect my past. But this new plan, this new purpose was about something far more powerful. It was about using that past to build a better future for everyone. The plans on my drafting table were no longer just a dream. They had become a set of formal architectural blueprints as detailed and precise as any I had ever created for a paying client. They had a project number, they had a title, they had a purpose. But a blueprint is only a promise. To give it life, you must break ground. You must begin the work. And the first step in this new construction was not to dig a foundation, but to make a public declaration. The days of secrets and quiet strategic moves were over. The fortress had served its purpose. Now it was time to open the gates. I spent a week making the preparations. These were not the frantic, clandestine preparations of a man at war. They were the calm, methodical arrangements of an architect preparing to unveil a new project. I did not call the major news networks or the sensationalist bloggers who had feasted on the scraps of Connor's spectacular downfall. I had no interest in creating a media circus. This was not about them. This was about the legacy. I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a young architectural critic at the local paper, a woman whose writing I admired for its intelligence and its deep understanding of how buildings shape the life of a city. The second was to the head of the Atlanta Historical Society, a man I had known professionally for years. The third was to a community organizer from the old neighborhood, a tireless woman who fought every day for the people the city had forgotten. I invited them and a handful of others like them to a small press conference. I did not tell them the specific nature of the announcement. I simply said that I would be making a statement regarding the future of the Carter House. Their curiosity, I knew, would be enough. The day of the announcement, I awoke with a profound sense of calm. I did not feel nervous. I felt ready. Jamal arrived early, not as my lawyer this time, but as my friend. He helped me carry the chairs from the house out into the garden. We did not use rented chairs. I used every dining chair, every office chair, every spare chair I owned. We arranged them in neat rows on the lawn facing the back porch, which would serve as my stage. I was careful to place the chairs in a way that did not disturb Rose's favorite flower beds. I imagined her watching me, a slight amused smile on her face. I think she would have approved. She had always believed that a house was not meant to be a fortress, but a gathering place. After the chairs were set, I brought out the final piece. It was a simple wooden lectern. I had built it myself in my workshop over the past few days from a piece of salvaged walnut. It was not fancy. It was simple, solid, and honest. The work of a craftsman. I placed it on the porch, centered in front of the doors that led to the living room. The stage was set. The empty chairs sat on the green grass waiting. The simple lectern stood on the porch, a silent promise of the words to come. The house itself, my beautiful, complicated, historic house, was the backdrop for it all. Jamal and I stood in the kitchen looking out at the scene. "Are you ready for this, Eli?" he asked, his voice quiet. I thought about the question. I thought about the 50 years of work and love that had been poured into this place. I thought about my great-grandfather's tin box of pennies. I thought about the pain of the last 6 months and the quiet joy of the last few weeks working on my new plans. This was not an ending. It was not a victory lap. It was a beginning. It was the first day of construction on the most important project of my life. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I am. Let's open the doors and let the future in." The small group of reporters and community leaders began to arrive just before 10 o'clock. They mingled in the garden, speaking in low, respectful tones, their curiosity palpable. Jamal greeted them at the door, a gracious host, while I remained in the kitchen collecting my thoughts. At precisely 10:15, Jamal gave me a nod. It was time. I walked out onto the back porch and stood behind the simple wooden lectern I had built. A quiet fell over the small crowd. I looked at their faces, the architectural critic, her expression sharp and analytical, the head of the historical society looking intrigued, the community organizer, her face a mask of cautious optimism. These were not the sharks Connor had courted. These were builders, preservers, and advocates. They were my people. I cleared my throat and began. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady, carrying easily in the quiet garden. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Elijah Carter, and this is my home." I paused, letting the simple statement settle. Recently, there has been a great deal of commercial interest in this property. Some have looked at this house and this land and have seen only its market value. They have seen a footprint on a map, an asset to be liquidated, a space to be cleared for something newer and shinier and more profitable. And for a time, I was forced to treat this house as what they saw it as, a fortress, a legal position to be defended. But I am an architect, not a soldier, and a house is not meant to be a fortress. It is meant to be a home. I looked out at the faces before me, making eye contact with each of them. But home is too small a word for this place. I built these walls with my own hands, but I did not build them with new materials. I built them with the bones of a history that some tried to erase. The support beams in this house came from a church community hall on Sweet Auburn. The ironwork on the staircase came from the city's first black-owned pharmacy. The very bricks are from a printing press that gave our community a voice when no one else would listen. A murmur went through the small crowd. The historical society director was nodding slowly, a look of dawning understanding on his face. "This house is not just my story," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "It is our story. It is an ark built to carry the memory of a community they tried to pave over. And a story this important, a legacy this precious, does not belong to one old man. It belongs to the city. It belongs to the future." This was the moment, the unveiling. That is why I'm not here today to talk about the past. I am here to break ground on a new future. I am officially announcing that this house will no longer be a private residence. I am in the process of establishing a new nonprofit foundation that will take ownership of the property in its entirety. It will be transformed according to the new blueprints I have designed into a new kind of institution for our community. I took a deep breath. It will be called the Rose Carter Center for Community History and Architectural Preservation. I spoke my wife's name, and for a moment my voice almost broke, but I pushed through, fueled by the power of my purpose. My late wife Rose was the true heart of this home. She was a gardener. She knew that the most important thing you can do is cultivate the soil so that new things can grow. And that is what this center will do. It will have two missions. First, to preserve. The house itself will become a living museum, a place where people can come and learn the history of the materials, the stories of the community that built this city. Second, and more importantly, to create. The upstairs will be converted into a workshop and residence for the Rose Carter Fellowship, a fully funded program for a new generation of young, brilliant architects and designers of color. They will come here to study our history and then go out into our city to design our future. I looked out at the faces again. The critic was scribbling furiously in her notepad, a look of genuine excitement on her face. The community organizer had tears in her eyes. This house will no longer be a fortress to keep people out. I concluded, my voice ringing with a conviction I had not felt in years. It will be a workshop to send people out. It will not be a monument to the past, but a foundation for the future. The work begins today. Thank you. I nodded and stepped back from the lectern. A stunned silence held the garden for a beat, and then it was broken by applause. It was not a polite professional applause. It was a heartfelt, joyous, and hopeful sound. It was the sound of a new thing being born. The applause in the garden was a warm, hopeful sound, a stark contrast to the silence and rage that had filled this house just 6 months ago. It washed over me, but I took no pride in it. This was not about me. I held up a hand, not to stop the applause, but to ask for their attention for one final moment. The small crowd grew quiet again, their faces expectant. My eyes scanned the back of the garden, past the reporters and the community leaders, to a figure standing half hidden in the shade of the ancient oak tree. It was Lena. I had sent her a simple formal invitation with no explanation, just a time and a date. I did not know if she would come. But she was here. She was not the poised, powerful woman in a silk dress I had last seen at the gala. She was dressed simply in a plain, dark dress. Her face was pale, her expression uncertain, vulnerable. She looked like a visitor from a foreign country, unsure of the customs, terrified of causing offense. She looked like a daughter who had lost her way home. There is one final piece of this new plan. I said, my voice quiet again, my eyes fixed on her. A legacy is not just about preserving what is old. It is also about mending what is broken. It is about believing in the possibility of restoration, not just for buildings, but for people. I saw her flinch as if my words were stones. The reporters were beginning to sense a new story, their pens poised, their eyes darting between me and the figure in the shadows. This center is named for my wife Rose, I continued, and Rose was a woman who believed in second chances. She believed that even from the most damaged soil, with enough care and hard work, something good and strong could grow. She never gave up on anything or anyone. I paused, and then I addressed her directly, my voice carrying across the lawn, a bridge of sound across a chasm of pain. My daughter, Lena Carter, is here with us today. A collective murmur went through the crowd as they turned to look at the woman by the tree. Lena shrank back slightly, her hands twisting in front of her, her face a mask of shame and dread. She looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. My daughter, I said, my voice clear and unwavering, is one of the most brilliant legal minds I have ever known. I have seen her command a courtroom. I have seen her build arguments with the same precision and strength that I use to build houses. In recent times, those formidable skills were misapplied. They were used to serve ambition instead of integrity. They were used in the service of a plan to tear something down. The words were blunt, honest. I would not whitewash the past. Redemption could not be built on a foundation of lies. I saw Lena's shoulders slump as if she were taking a physical blow. But a tool is not inherently good or evil, I said, looking directly at her now. It is defined by the work it does. And the work of this center will require a fierce and dedicated legal mind to protect it, to advocate for it, to ensure that its mission is never compromised. I took a deep breath. This was the final, most difficult piece of the new blueprint. Therefore, I would like to publicly invite Lena Carter to serve on the inaugural board of directors for the Rose Carter Center. A gasp went through the crowd. Lena looked up, her eyes wide with utter, uncomprehending shock. Tears began to well up, spilling down her cheeks. I held up my hand to quiet the murmurs. Let me be clear, I said, my voice hard with purpose. This is not an inheritance. It is a job. It is not a gift. It is a responsibility. Her role, should she choose to accept it, will not be to manage wealth. It will be to do the work, to use her skills to defend this legacy, to fight for our fellows, to ensure that the story of her great-grandfather Samuel Carter is honored not just in words, but in deeds. I looked at her one last time. This is your chance, Lena, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. To become a part of this story in the right way, to build something worthy of the name you carry. The decision is yours. I watched as she brought a trembling hand to her mouth. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She just nodded, a series of small, convulsive movements, her entire body shaking with a grief and a gratitude so profound it was beyond words. It was not forgiveness. It was not an embrace. It was a blueprint, a plan for a new structure, a path back to the foundation, and it was a start. As the reporters began to pack up their equipment and the community leaders started to talk amongst themselves in excited, hopeful tones, I remained at the lectern for a moment longer. The applause had been gratifying, but it was not what I was seeking. I looked at the small, attentive crowd at the garden my wife had built, and at the house that had been the silent witness to my entire life. I felt the need to offer one final definition, one final blueprint. A few months ago, I began my voice settling into a more intimate, reflective tone. If you had asked me what my legacy was, I would have given you a simple answer. I would have pointed to these walls. I would have told you that my legacy was this house, this property, this beautiful, valuable thing that I had built to pass on to my child. I believed, as many people do, that a legacy is a thing you possess, a treasure you lock away and protect to be handed down like a crown. I paused, looking at the plans for the new center that were displayed on an easel beside me. I was wrong. The events of the past year, as painful as they have been, have taught me a profound lesson. A legacy is not what you own. It is what you give away. A true legacy is not a static monument to your own life. It is a living foundation upon which others can build their own. For a time, I was forced to treat this house like a fortress. I reinforced its legal walls, I stood guard over its history, and I defended it against those who saw it only as a prize to be conquered. I won that battle, but a fortress by its very nature is a lonely, sterile place. It is a place of defense, not a place of growth. And my wife, Rose, the woman for whom this center is named, was never a soldier. She was a gardener. I gestured to the vibrant flower beds around us. She taught me that the most valuable thing you can do with a piece of land is not to build walls around it, but to cultivate the soil, to create the conditions for life, for growth, for a beauty that is shared with the world. A fortress protects a treasure. A garden creates one. That is the legacy I choose to build today. This house will no longer be my private treasure. It will be our community's garden. Its history will be the soil rich with the stories of those who came before us. The fellowship we establish will be the seeds planting the potential for a new generation of builders and creators. And the work they do, the affordable homes they design, the public parks they create, that will be the harvest, a harvest that will feed this city for generations to come. I looked over at Lena, who was now standing with Jamal. Her face was still tear-stained, but for the first time I saw something other than shame in her eyes. I saw a flicker of purpose. My great-grandfather Samuel Carter spent 50 years saving pennies to buy this land. He did not do it so that one of his descendants could live in a big house. He did it so that the story of the Carters could change, so that a story that began in servitude could one day become a story of creation. This center is the fulfillment of his dream, the ultimate return on his investment. His legacy was not the land itself. It was the possibility he created for all of us who came after. I took a final look at the faces before me, at the home behind me, and at the blueprints for the future beside me. My work is almost done. I said, a sense of peace settling over me, deep and profound. I have laid the foundation. Now it is time for the next generation to start building. Thank you. And with that, I stepped away from the lectern and walked into the garden, ready to see what would grow. Lesson from the story. They say a man's home is his castle, but I learned it's much more. It's a library of memories, a testament to sacrifice and the soil from which legacy grows. Respect isn't demanded through authority or given out of fear. It is earned through character and integrity. True wealth isn't measured by what you can acquire and possess, but by what you can build and preserve for those who come after you. Sometimes the quietest actions create the loudest statements, reminding everyone that dignity, like a home's foundation, is never for sale. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated you? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for listening.